In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a real-time chat application with GitHub authentication, and I'm also going to show you how I would build this in the real world, how I would use AI, autocomplete, and various different MCP tools to make this as easy as possible. But this isn't just your basic real-time chat application. We actually have various different rooms. You can create your own room. We have private rooms and public rooms. And when you have a room, you also have the ability to invite people into that room as well. So we have a lot of different permissions and stuff that we need to handle. That makes this an even more advanced chat related project than it first seems. We're also going to be using the video sponsor Supabase as the backend of choice, mostly for the real-time features because it makes hooking up all the real-time chat stuff so much easier than doing it by hand, especially because Next.js really doesn't let you do real-time WebSocket stuff. It just does not work. So we're going to be using Supabase for all that real-time related content. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle, and to get started with this project, we need to first create a Next.js application because that's what we're going to be using. So we can say create Next app at latest, put a period at the end there. That's going to give us the latest version of Next.js with all the different tools that we need. We're going to be using TypeScript and ESLint and everything for this project, so we'll select those options as soon as they come up. There we go. We're just going to go with the recommended defaults because that has ESLint, Tailwind, and all those other things that I like. We'll give that a quick second to install. And now that that's done, we have all of our different files on the left-hand side here with everything that we need. Now, one thing that the defaults don't do is put a source folder. So I'm just going to add a source folder. I'm going to put our app inside of that. I generally like to have a source folder as I find it easier to work with. We also probably need to change our tsconfig to say that we have that source folder as well. So there we go. Now that we have that in there, we have everything that we need. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this video, we are going to be using Supabase for this project. So let me expand this over and we're just going to create a brand new project that we can use. We can give this any name that we want. We're just going to call this real-time chat. And then we can give this a password. I'm just going to generate a random password there. We can click copy if we want it. This is just for our database. And then we can say that we want to create that new project. It'll take a second to create everything in the background. And then we essentially just need to hook this up with Next.js. Now there's lots of different things this page mentions that we can start working on, but really the first thing I want to do is hook up Supabase to Next.js. And the nice thing is Supabase has this really great UI library that's built on top of Shadcn that has all the different components you could possibly want. In our case, we're going to be starting with the block right here for the client, and this includes our client, our middleware, and our server, which is just all the different ways we can hook up to using Supabase in our project. So let's go ahead and actually try to get Shadcn set up in our project. Shadcn at latest. We want to initialize that in our project. And we'll also want to copy this command up here. This command is just allowing us to install this block into our project using Shadcn, and it's going to give us these three files. Now this one really doesn't depend on Shadcn because it's really just the glue that hooks Supabase and Next.js together, but you can see it's going to give us that, and it added some variables to our env file as well, which is really great. Now if we take a look at the code that actually generated inside the source, you can see that we have this lib folder, and inside of here we have our server section, we have our middleware section, and we have our client section. And this really just hooks up a bunch of different stuff inside of our project. So let's go ahead and go through each one of these different things. This one is for creating a client on your browser. So essentially, how do you hook up with Supabase on the client? This is what this is, and it just hooks up our different environment variables to this. That works fine. Our middleware section is a little bit more complex here. You can see there's actually quite a lot of stuff going on. The main thing is this update session function, which is going to be used when we start implementing authentication to update all the cookies for Next.js. So you can see inside of here, all it's doing is it's saying how do we update our cookie information inside of Next.js, and we can call this inside of our middleware to make sure we update our session with all the information that comes from our cookies and to set our cookies properly, and it just handles all of that for us. Also, you can see inside of here that if the user is not logged in, it's going to redirect them to the login page for us automatically by going to auth/login. So that essentially just sets up all of that code for us, which is really nice. Lastly, if we look at the server version of this, you'll note it's very similar. You can see we have our environment variables. And then finally, we're just telling Supabase how do we get our cookie information, because Next.js handles cookies a little bit weird because they have this fancy cookie function right here. So that essentially gives us the glue to be able to hook up to Supabase on the client as well as on the server and to hook up things inside of our middleware. Now what I want to do is I want to update our environment variables because right now they're completely blank. So we can go over to our Supabase project specifically, and we want to search for the section for our API keys. That's going to be down here inside of project settings, and then we can see API keys. We want to use this new version of API keys, not the legacy version. We'll just create a new set of keys right here, and this will give us a public key as well as a secret key. So here you can see we have our publishable key. I'm just going to copy that and paste it down in this publishable or anon key right here. And then we're going to need to put what our Supabase URL is going to be as well. Easiest way for us to find that is to click this connect button, go over to app frameworks. We're on Next.js here. You can see we have our next Supabase URL. We'll just copy that URL. It'll be different for you than it is for me. And again, we'll paste that into our page. So now if we go ahead and look at our environment variables, you can see we have our URL as well as this public key that can be used specifically on the client. We're also going to want to get the secret key as well because we're going to be doing some server-side stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to my secret key section. I'm going to copy that, and we'll just call this our Supabase secret key, and we'll paste in that secret key that we copied from our environment variables. Now from here, just to test that we have everything working, I want to get authentication set up in our application. So if we go over to that UI library, we have a password-based authentication that we can set up, or we can do social-based authentication. This defaults to using GitHub. You can change it to whatever you want, but we are going to be using GitHub, so this actually works great. So we can just copy over this command and we're going to run this, and this is going to install quite a few different components. We're going to get an error page, a login page, an OAuth page specifically for our GitHub section. We're going to get a protected page as well as a login form and a logout button component that we can use. And again, those different middleware related stuff down below. So if we go ahead and we actually look at all the code that's being generated for us, you can see in our app, we now have this auth section that has a login page, which has our login form. We have this whole OAuth route right here, which is just setting up all of the different stuff for Supabase to be able to do that GitHub authentication. And it's working specifically inside of Next, so you can see all the Next related stuff that's in it. We have an error page to show people if there's an error logging in. And then finally, we have this random protected page that they get redirected to after they're logged into our application. And this is a really great just for testing out if our application works or if it doesn't work like we expect it to, because essentially every single page is going to be protected except for our login page. So if they're not logged in, they should automatically redirect to login. Also, you can see it created our middleware for us, and it's using that update session section. We just want to make sure that this is importing from the right location. Looks like it got it from the wrong location. So we're going to go inside of here and get that middleware file just like that. Now everything else should be perfectly fine. So let's test our application. We're going to say npm run dev just like that. And we'll wait for a second for that to open up. And we should just be able to refresh our page over here, get rid of that old content that we had, and specifically try to get our new content. And also, you can see here, I'm using the brand new version of Next.js that literally came out a few days ago, and they changed essentially this middleware file to be a proxy file now. It's set it up here inside the errors. So essentially all we need to do is rename middleware to proxy, just like that. And we need to change this function to say proxy instead of middleware, and that'll fix those errors that we were getting because I'm just on the newest version of Next.js. Now you can see that we're getting this sign in page. It says sign into your account to continue, and we need to continue with GitHub. Obviously, I haven't set up any of my stuff with GitHub, so we're going to get some error messages just saying, hey, unsupported provider, blah, blah, blah. I just haven't set up the proper environment variables for my application. Now, the really nice thing is setting this up with GitHub is quite easy. We even have instructions on how to do it specifically on this page. If you scroll down a little ways, you can see we have getting started, setting our environment variables, and then we have our section on setting up our third-party provider. We click on auth providers here. That's going to bring us to where we can select our project, and then you can see here, allow the users to sign up. I'm just going to make it so that they don't have to worry about confirming email. We'll just save that. And then if we go down to auth providers, we don't have email, so we're going to disable the email section. So we'll just save that real quick. And then we can scroll down until we find the GitHub section right here. And we want to enable GitHub so we can enable it. And we need to copy over our client ID and our client secret, as well as this callback URL, which we bring over to GitHub. Now to hook all this up, we need to go to GitHub, click on your settings tab. And at the very bottom, you'll see this section called developer settings. If you click on this, you can see we have GitHub apps as well as OAuth apps. You can already see I have quite a few inside of here. We just want to create a brand new OAuth app. Give it whatever name you want. We'll call this Supabase Realtime. That's what I called our project. Our homepage URL, you can put anything you want. Obviously, if this is a real project, put your real project URL, but we're just doing this locally, so we'll say localhost. That callback URL we copied is going to go right here. And then when we register our application, we're going to be getting a client ID, which we of course need to put in the client ID section. And then we can generate a client secret. Once we do that, you can see we have our client secret. We can copy this over, and then we can use that inside of our application as well. Give that a quick save. And now we have GitHub actually hooked up with our application and enabled, which means if we go back into our application, just give it a quick refresh and click continue with GitHub. You can see authorize with GitHub. It's using my GitHub account. And if I click authorize, I should be redirected and I should be logged in. And you can see it's got my email and I have a logout button. And when I log out, it brings me back to the sign in page. Now it's really nice that Supabase has those blocks because we can get set up with auth incredibly easily. And it's a super boilerplate thing that's not very fun to actually implement yourself. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I want to go into our application. I essentially just want to force it to be in dark mode. So we're going to go into our layout here, wherever we have our classes here. I'm just going to add a class of dark just to force us to be in dark mode so it's a little bit easier on your eyes. Inside of our page here, we can just export default function homepage. There we go. We'll just return null from here for now. And then inside this protected page, we really don't need this protected page at all. All we're going to have is this normal page and then our auth related pages. So in our auth, whenever we actually successfully log someone in, we need to make sure we redirect them to the correct locations. I believe to find that if we go into our login form, we should hopefully see where people are being redirected. You can see right here, we are being redirected to the /protected page. I just want to redirect to the / page just like this. So that'll just redirect them back to the home page essentially, because that's where I want the home page of my application to be. Now, if I actually log in with GitHub and it finishes that out, I'm redirected to the home page, which right now we're rendering nothing on, which is why we just get a black screen, but that is what I want to show on our page. page. Now, before we start diving into our Next.js code itself, I'm actually going to close out of all of this. We're going to go back over to Supabase because I want to set up our database. I do this in pretty much every project. I like to set up the database as one of the very first things inside my project. So we can go over here to the database tab, and here we can create a brand new table. So now we're going to have essentially 4 different tables inside of our application. We're going to have a table for our chat rooms. We're going to have a table for our messages. We're going to have a table for all the users that are inside of chat rooms, just being able to track who is in each chat room so we know which ones they're a member of. And then finally, we're going to have a table specifically for our user information, their image, their name, and so on. So the first one that I want to do is going to be our chat room. So we can just say chat room. We can give it some description if we want. We're going to enable low row level security. Essentially, that allows us to access this data from the client without having to have a server in between it. And we use row level security inside of Postgres to hook all that up. I'll show you what that's all about in a little bit, but we can move down here to where our columns are. Now, I personally like to use UUID columns for everything, so we're going to use a UUID for our ID, create that field, that's perfectly fine. And then we really just need to add 2 columns. The first one is going to be a name column. This one is going to be a varchar because it's just a string, just like that. And I want to make sure that it is not nullable because we don't want this to be null. And then we're going to add a column here called is_public. That just determines, is this a public field or not? And again, this is going to be Boolean, just like that. And for this one, again, I do not want it to be nullable, and we don't really need to worry about putting a default inside of there. So now we have a name for all of these, as well as an is this a public chat room or not. With all of that done, we don't have any foreign keys or anything to worry about. We can just click save, and that's going to create that table for us. Now all we need to do is go through and create essentially our other 3 tables inside of our application. So we can come into here. We want to create a brand new table. This one is going to be for our messages, just like that. And actually, we should probably create our user profile first so that we can reference that table properly. So we have our user profile right there. This one, we're going to come down to the very bottom. We have created at, we have ID, and this ID is actually going to be a foreign key. So I want to come into here, make sure that this is a UUID, just like that. And I want to make sure that this is a foreign key. So we can click on that little chain icon. We want to link this to our auth table specifically, and we want to link it to the users table. And I want to link the ID of these 2 tables together, just so that way I have an easy way to reference between the auth table that has a bunch of information in it. You can see like roles and all those other things with this table that's going to contain a much more pared down version of our information. Now for this, I want to just set cascade and cascade. Essentially, if I delete my user, it's going to delete the information in this table as well. Now we're going to give that a quick save. We have that ID hooked up. Next thing I need to do is specify what different fields that I want. In our case, we want a name field, which is a varchar. And again, we'd want to make sure that this is not nullable. And then finally, we're going to have an image URL, and this one can be null. So we're going to come in here with a varchar, and we'll leave that is nullable checked because it could be a null field. Now with all that out of the way, we have everything we have hooked up. We can give that a quick save. It should create that table for us and hook up all of our different foreign key relations that we need inside of our application. Now with that done, let's create the join table between these 2. So that's going to be a chat room member, just like that. Inside of this table, we don't really care about this ID field because we're going to be using a joint ID. So we're going to get rid of that. And instead, I'm going to have a member ID. And then I'm also going to have a field for my chat room ID. Just like that. Our member ID is again going to be a foreign key that points to that user profile ID table. And for this one, we can say we want to do a cascade and a cascade again. If I delete my member, I should obviously delete all of their different associations with their different chat rooms. Same thing here, our chat room is going to be linked up to our chat room table, and we're going to put both of these as cascade as well, because if we delete the room, obviously we don't care about tracking who is in those rooms. Now all we need to do is make these into a primary key. So of course we don't want these to be nullable, so we're going to remove that is nullable section on there. And then we can just check this primary key on both of these. So now we have essentially a joint primary key or a composite primary key that uses both of these different fields. Just because they're already unique, we can never have one member that's inside of the same room multiple times. We'll give that a save, and that essentially gives us our join table to be able to link between our users and the chat rooms that they are a part of. The last thing we need to do is to have a table that stores all the different messages we're sending between these users. So we're going to have a message table just like that. Now for this, I'm going to be using UUID just because I like that over a normal ID. We're going to have the text that is inside of here, and this is just going to use the text type because that's a little bit larger than a varchar. This again cannot be null. Next thing that we're going to have inside of here is our chat room ID. And then we're also going to have our author ID. This is the person that wrote the message, and this is the room you sent it in. So of course we need to hook up those foreign keys. Chat room points to the chat room table just like that. And if we delete the chat room, obviously we should delete the message that's associated with it, just like that. And then of course we can do the same thing with our author. This is going to point to that user profile page, to the ID section of it, And again, if we delete the user, we'll just delete all the messages associated with that user as well. So we'll give that a quick save, make sure that neither of these are nullable because they cannot be null. And now we have this entire table created as well. We'll just give that a quick save. And that should be all of the different database tables that we need inside of our application fully created, which is really nice. I generally like to do this at the start of every project because once I have my database tables in mind, it makes it easier for me to create my UI and do all my different queries and so on. So now let's go back into our application and take a look at our code, because what I want to do inside of our page, instead of just having it return null, I want to return essentially an empty page, a page that says, hey, there are no rooms yet. Why don't you create your very first room? And then once we have rooms created in our database, we can go ahead and further make this page show those different rooms. So this first thing is like an empty view that we're going to have inside of our application. So we're going to come on here with a class name. We're going to give this a class name of container, MX auto, just to put it in the center. We're going to give it a max width as well of 3XL. Padding right here is going to be set to 4 in the X direction. We're also going to do some padding in the Y direction of 8 just to make it really spaced out. And we'll do a space Y of 8 to really space out our content. Now inside of here, we're going to be using a brand new Shadcn component called empty. So let's just make sure we install that. npx shadcn at latest add, and we want to add the empty component, which essentially makes it really easy to create these cards that represent an empty state in our application. So we can say empty just like that. Inside of this empty, we're going to add a class name of border and border dashed. So we have a nice dashed border around it. We're then going to have an empty header. Inside of that, we're going to have an empty media. This is essentially for like an icon. So what we can do inside of here is we can put our message square icon. That's just a nice little message bubble icon. And for our empty media, we can put the variant to icon. Now, if we just give that a quick save already, we should see in our application we have that nice little icon as well as a dashed border that goes around this entire thing. Now, obviously, we need text inside of here to represent what's all going on. So after our empty media inside of our header still, we're going to add an empty title. Just like that. This is just going to say no chat rooms. And then below that, we'll have an empty description. And inside this description, we'll just say create a new chat room to get started. There we go. So now you can see we have that text. The final thing I want to do is to actually have some content inside of here for the button that's going to represent creating that. So let's just add a button as well from Shadcn. And we can use that button component directly from Shadcn. We want this to be as a child though, because inside of it, we're really going to be using a link that links to a different page. And this page will be rooms/new. And we can just say create room. There we go. Now, if we give that a save, we have this nice button. It shows up on our page. It has a maximum size for it. And if I click on this, it brings me to that page, which we don't have created yet. Now, before we start diving into creating actual chat rooms, the next thing that I wanted to work on is a navigation bar above our page that allows us to log in and log out of this application. Because right now we're logged in, but we have no way to log out or no way to log in once we actually log out. So inside of our application here, inside this component section, I'm going to create a brand new navbar.tsx component. This is going to be a client component because it's going to need access to our logged in state if we're logged in or not. And we'll just export a function from here called navbar. We'll make sure this is the default, just like that. And really the first thing that I need inside of here is my user. So we're going to create a hook called use current user, just like that. And this hook is going to essentially go inside of a new folder we're going to call services. And we're going to put a Supabase folder inside of there to handle all of our Supabase related code. I'm going to bring in our client, our middleware, and our server from Supabase into here. And I'm also going to create a new folder called hooks, where we're going to put our hooks for this. I'm also going to create a folder for components because we have our logout button and our login form. Those are both Supabase related. So we'll bring those in as components for this section, just like that. Make sure that I save everything with the correct imports. There we go. And now what I want to do inside of my hook section that we just created is I want to create a brand new file called usecurrentuser.tsx. Actually, we'll just do TS because we don't actually need any JSX code inside of here. We're going to export a function called usecurrentuser. And inside this usecurrentuser, we want to get the user from Supabase. And to do that, we're going to put it inside of a use effect because we want this to load essentially right away. Just like that. And inside of here, we want to get Supabase. So to get our Supabase code, we can say create client. That's going to create our client. And we want to make sure we get the client version, not the server version, just like that. That's going to create us a brand new Supabase client, which we'll just call Supabase, just like that. And now we can use this to access any part of our code. For example, we can call auth.getUser, and that's going to get our user from the database. And then we can do various different things with the data that we get from here. For example, we're going to get this data property. And then inside of here, we can say data.user to get our actual user information. So we can just say set user, which is a variable we're going to create. And we can set it directly to that user. So we can say const user set user is going to be equal to this use state variable, just like this. There we go. And use state is going to have this type of user. So let's make sure I import that and import user directly from that Supabase library. And this Supabase library is installed automatically for us when we did all of our Shadcn installing of like the login pages. So let's make sure this can be null or a user, and that looks like that hooks up everything properly. And down here, we can return that user information as well as other information because we want to store a loading state as well. So we're going to say is loading and set is loading by default. We'll just come in here with false on that. And actually, I want to set that to true by default because at the very first thing we do is actually load our application right here. So inside of our application, we can make sure we add a finally, and inside this finally section, we can just set is loading equal to false, and we can make sure we return our is loading down here as well. Another thing I want to do is not just get what my user currently is, but I also want to refresh anytime my user information changes. So what we can do is we can say supabase.auth, and we can use the onAuth state changed hook just like this. This is going to give us the event, which we don't actually care about, but what we do care about is all of our session related information, which we can use to set our user. So we can get the session.user if that exists. Otherwise, we can just default to the value of null. So you can see here, we're either going to get our user or we're going to set that value to null. And that's actually going to give us some various data back from it. And we can use this to unsubscribe whenever this use effect hook reruns. So here we can do a quick return. And inside this return, we can do data.subscription.unsubscribe to just make sure we no longer are listening to those changes. So here we get what the current logged in state of the user is. Then we listen to any changes in case they log in or out. And then we make sure that we reset this hook to use the proper subscription every single time we rerun this use effect, even though it shouldn't ever rerun. So that's everything we need for this use current user hook. So by using this in our application, we now have whatever the current state of our user is. And this is user and is loading just like that. Now for this entire section, we can come in here, we can return a navbar just like that. And I actually want to wrap this navbar inside of a div. So let's just come in here with another nav like that. And this outer nav, I'm going to be a div because this is just going to correspond to our state for things. For example, we're going to have a border on the bottom and the background of this is just going to be our background color. And then finally, we're going to set the height of this to a special custom variable called header, which we're going to create inside of our CSS. So let's kind of minimize down all these different files. We're going to go into our CSS, into our theme section. We can go down to the bottom. We can set a height to header just like that. And we can say that our header height is going to be 4 rem. There we go. And we can also do the exact same thing for creating essentially a height minus the header. So we can say here, this is going to be a height of screen with header. There we go. And we just want to do a quick calculation. And this calculation is essentially 100 VH minus our height of our actual header. So this gives us our header. And then this gives us essentially the full height minus whatever our header is. So we maybe should call this without header instead of with header. Actually, I'll just leave it with header just like that. So now with that done, we can close out of that, go back into our navbar, and now this header will have a specific height to it. Now our actual header itself is going to have some styles on it. For example, we're going to use container, MX auto, PX4, kind of the same styles we've used before. I'm going to flex it, everything in the center, so we'll justify between, and items in the center. So it's just going to push our items away from each other. So our label is going to be on the left, and our actual button is going to be on the right. Now inside of here, we're going to have a link. This link is going to essentially lead back to our homepage. And this is just going to be what our application is called. We're going to call this Supachat, kind of a pun on Supabase. And this will redirect us back to that homepage. And we'll just give it a class of extra large and font bold. There we go. And to make sure we actually see what our navbar looks like, let's go into our layout and render that navbar. Navbar, just like that. And we should probably wrap all the children inside of a main content as well. There we go. So now if we give that a save, you can see we have that header section showing up with Supachat right there. Now we are missing a few styles. We want to add a height of full on here to make sure that this actually fills the full height for that centering. And we'll add a gap of 4 just to space out our left and right side content. Now our left and right side content is going to be entirely depending on if we are in the loading state or if our user equals null, we want to fall back to essentially a sign in button. But if they're currently signed in, we want to render a logout button instead. So let's go ahead and just put null down for both of these for now. There we go. So we at least have something rendering. And the first thing I want to reference is going to be what happens when they need to log in. So we can add a button here. This button is going to be as a child because we're just going to link them to the sign in page. So let's close out of that button. There we go. And then inside of this section for our button, we can make it a link. And this link just goes to the sign in page and we can make it say sign in. There we go, give that a quick save. And you can see that immediately disappeared because we are currently signed in. So we need to go to this other section. And this other section is going to render out essentially our name as well as a button to log out. So we're gonna have a class name of flex, item center, gap of 2 to space out our content. Then inside of here, I'm going to be rendering out a span. There we go. The span is going to have our user's name. So to get our user's name, we can say user dot, and we want to get the user metadata, and we want to get their preferred username. This is specifically coming from GitHub. GitHub has this preferred username that they can use inside of here. So that's going to be giving us their name, or if they don't have one, we'll just render out whatever their email is instead. There we go. That gives us all the content for their name. And then finally, we can just render out that logout button, and this comes directly from the actual application. There we go. We have our logout button, and that comes from our Supabase blocks that we actually implemented and used. Now, I do want to make some modifications to this button. For example, I want to change the variant on this to be the outline variant, and I want to change the size on it to be small just to make it a little bit less large inside of our application. There we go. Then what I can do is go back into my navbar here. On this span, I want to add a text small to this and a text muted foreground as well, just to make it smaller and a little bit more gray. So now you can see we have our username as well as the button to log out. And if I click that button, you can see I'm redirected back to the sign in page here. This doesn't quite look right though, because we now have our header. So I want to go over to our auth page for our login. And here you can see that we have our height being set to the full screen height. So we can actually modify this by saying min h is going to be the height with the screen with the header. There we go. And now if we give that a save, you can see that remove the scroll bar, because essentially we made the rest of our page the height of everything minus our header. We should also fix our error page as well by doing the exact same thing. So inside of our error page here, this is going to be our height with the header, so screen with header. There we go. So if we have an error, it's going to redirect here and have the proper height on everything. Now let's go ahead and sign back in. So we're redirected back to that page. And when I click create room, I actually want to implement this page. So we're going to minimize down all of the auth related stuff, create a brand new file called rooms. And inside of here, we're going to put a folder called new, and we'll create a page.tsx, export default function. We'll just call this new room page. And if we return null, it should just show us a blank page, which is what we want for now. Now, the next thing that we need to do is hook all of this up with form related stuff. So we're going to be installing 3 libraries: hook form resolvers, Zod, and React hook form. These 3 libraries are just a way for us to use React hook form with Zod. We also need to make sure that we use Shadcn components. So we're going to say that we want to add all of the field related components, which is the brand new way in Shadcn to deal with forms. We're also going to get the input component, and we're going to get the checkbox as well, because we're going to be using those components in our application for our form. Now with our actual form page set up, what we can do is we can come to the very top, make sure that this is a client component, just like that. Then we can set up our form schema. So our form schema is going to be z from zod.object, and this object is going to have a name, which is going to be a string. And we'll just say it has a minimum value of 1, and we want to trim off any empty space from it. Next, we're going to have an isPublic, and this isPublic is going to be a z.boolean, just like that. Now we can also get our type from this for our form data, which is just going to be inferring our form schema type. Now we can use that with the use form hook that comes from React hook form. Now for this hook, we want to make sure we use that form data type. For our resolver, we can come in here with our resolver. This is going to be a Zod resolver, which we want to import and pass in our schema. And then we also want to pass in all of our default values. So we're going to have name and isPublic, just like that. And by default, I'm actually going to set isPublic to false. So it's going to be a private room by default with no name at all. And that's all of our form related content. We're also going to want to have a function called handle submit that takes in all of our form data, and we'll have it do something with that in a little bit. And then obviously we need to render out our form itself. So we can come down here with our form, and inside of that, we can add our onSubmit, which is going to call that handle submit function we just created. Now, I essentially want to wrap this entire thing inside of a card. So I'm going to import the card component as well from Shadcn. And inside of here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a div that's just going to be our outer wrapper for our entire application. There we go. And this is just going to set up all of our container related stuff. So we're going to have a container, mx auto, px4, and py8, kind of the same standard stuff we've been doing. And then I can use all my card related stuff. So down here, with our card, we're going to put a class name of wFull to make it fill the full space. And we're going to give it a max width of large, and we'll say mx auto, just so it doesn't get too large. Then we can have our card header, which inside of that is going to have a card title, which will just say new room. And if we wanted, we could give this a card description as well. We'll just say, yeah, something like that. Create a new chat room. Doesn't really matter. Put whatever you want inside of there. Then comes our card content, and that is where our form is going to go directly inside this section. Now, the really nice thing about this new field component inside of Shadcn is it's very unopinionated. And if you want to learn even more about this, I have a full deep dive I just created that covers how to use this new field component, how to make a really nice wrapper library around it, and how to use it with TanStack form or React Hook form. I'll link that video in the cards and description for you. But we're just going to do the absolute basics here because our form is quite small. First, we're going to create a field group that allows us to create spacing between our different elements. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a controller inside of here, and we're going to give it a name here of name. We're going to give it our controller, which is our form.control. And then finally, we're going to be rendering out some content inside of here. Now, obviously, our content is going to be quite a bit more complicated than this. We're going to be using the field component itself. This has a data invalid property, which we can set to our field state, which we actually are not even importing here. Field state, there we go. So we can get our field state .invalid. We don't need to worry about labels or anything like that. That gives us our field. Close that off just like that. Next thing that we need to do inside of here is to set up our field label. There we go. Our field label is going to say room name. And on this field label, we need to specify the HTML4 for this. Generally, I just like to set it to the field name. So we can say field.name just like that. Then the final thing we need to do is to add our input. So we can say input, get this again from Shadcn. Pass it along all of our different field props, pass it along an ID that matches our HTML4, and then finally pass along an area invalid, which again is going to be our field state invalid. Lastly, we want to add in any errors. So if we have a field state.error, then I want to render out the field error component. And the field error component, all it does is it takes in a prop of errors, and it's going to be an array that is our field state.error. There we go. And let's just make sure I get everything closed off properly. There we go. Now you can see we have that import right here. And if for some reason it has an error, you can see that it's going to show that error to me, which is exactly what I want. Now I essentially need to do the exact same thing for my checkbox. So I'm going to copy down this controller. This one is going to be for the is public field, just like that. And this one, instead of an input, I'm going to be using a checkbox right there. Now for our checkbox, I specifically want to get a few things from my field. So for my field, I want to get the value and the on change. And the rest of the field properties I'll leave as is. So here you can see I'm setting my checked and my on change specifically to the value and the on change right here. Then we have our area invalid, which we're keeping just like we did before. We have our field label here. This one is going to say public room, just like that. I'm going to put our label after our checkbox. You'll see why in a second. You can see now I have my checkbox. It looks super ugly. That's because I need to change the orientation of my field to a horizontal field. That'll lay it out side by side. And now you can see my checkbox looks really nice. I'm also going to change a class name on here to font normal, just to make that so it's not bolded. I'm going to wrap these inside of a field content. That way my error is directly below my label, because otherwise it would push it all the way to the right side of my page, which doesn't really look great. And the last thing we need to do is to add essentially a button to our page, and we can also wrap that in a field as well. We're going to make this an orientation of horizontal as well, because we're actually going to have two buttons inside of here. We'll make sure this is a full width section as well. And then inside of here, I want to have two buttons. So we're going to say button number 1 and button number 2. Now our very first button is just going to be essentially our submit button. So we're going to say type of submit. We don't really need to worry about the class name on here of margin left auto, but we do want to make it grow to full size. So it's going to be our biggest one. And this will just say create room, just like that. Now our second button, we're going to use an outline button. We don't need to worry about any spacing on that, just like that. It's already handled for us by this field component. But this one we want to be an as child because we essentially want to redirect the user with a link. So we can say a link that brings us back to the home page, just like that. Let's import this link component. There we go. Now to make sure we properly handle loading, we're going to come in here with a disabled state, make sure that when we're submitting our form, this is disabled. And I'm also going to be importing another component. This actually comes from my own component library at WDS. You can import this yourself just by saying at WDS / and we're going to be getting in the loading swap component. This just allows us to swap in a loading spinner over the place of any other piece of content in our page. So what we can do is we can say here where it has create room, we can say we want to wrap that in a loading swap. And essentially anytime is loading is set to true, it's going to give us a loading spinner. Otherwise, it's just going to render the text below as normal. So now if we had something that was a valid room and I click create room, right now it doesn't do anything. But if we just come up here and we add in a fake wait inside of here, so let's just make this async. There we go. And we're just going to await a new promise. There we go, 1 second wait. And now when I click create room, you can see we get that spinner for 1 second, and that just looks really great. That's what that loading swap component does. I have a bunch of different components in this library. I'll link it in the description if you want to check it out, but it's super easy to install and it's built into Shadcn. Now, the next thing I want to do is I actually want to create an action that's going to be handling this, because we're going to be doing this on the server instead of on the client. And the reason for this is because I want to be able to create this brand new room and then also automatically add the user to the room, even if it's a private room, because you normally can't join private rooms yourself. You have to be invited to them or create a room that is private. So we're going to be handling this on the server with an action. So inside of our services here for Supabase, let's create a folder for actions. And inside of here, let's create a page for rooms.ts. And we'll make sure that this is a server component just like that. And we're going to export a function that's asynchronous. And this is just going to be called create room just like that. And it takes in our unsafe data. And our unsafe data is going to be z.infer type, and that's that form schema type, just like that. Now, to make sure we have access to this form schema, we should probably put it in its own file. So we can come into our section here, we'll create a new folder, schemas, and inside of here, we'll just say rooms.ts. There we go. And I'm just going to copy over that schema. So inside of where we were, which was inside of our app, inside of our new room, we can scroll all the way up to that schema. I'm just going to remove that from here. I'm going to put it in that brand new file that I just created. There we go. This is going to be called create room schema. Import Zod. Export this. And now we can use this inside of our code. So here, it's that create room schema. And then if we go back into our page, form schema just needs to be replaced with create room schema. There we go. That should clean up all the errors, and you can see everything's rendering the same as it was before. So now we need to go ahead and implement this action. First, let's parse out our data. If we're going to do this as a safe parse, so we're going to come in here with safe parse. That's going to give us a success as well as the data that we want to get from there. And if we don't have a success, then we're going to return down an error. Now I'm going to return my error as an error with a value of true and a message that just says invalid room data. That's perfectly fine. There we go. Next, what we can do is we can try to get the user. So we can say const user equals await, and we're going to create a function called get current user, just like that. So let's copy this. We're going to come into Supabase here. We're going to create a folder called lib, and inside of here, we're just going to create a file called get current user.ts. Export a function get current user. There we go. And inside of here, I want to get my Supabase client. So we can say Supabase equals create client. There we go. And I want to make sure I get this from the server version, not the client version, because we're doing this on the server. I can even come up here and say like use server on this if I really wanted to, but this is a server only file. So this is going to be on the server. And then what I want to do is I want to come into here and say supabase.auth.getUser. And I want to specifically await the call of this. So we'll say await on this. And then we want to get the data.user. There we go. Make sure this is an async function. There we go. And auth right here is for some reason giving me errors. Let me make sure I call that. I have to await the Supabase here. So we'll say await just like that. Clean that up. There we go. And then we're awaiting this particular section. So let me just make sure I wrap all this properly. There we go. Get my parentheses in the right place. So that's going to give us our user, which is a user object or null. Essentially the same thing that we did inside of our hook, but this is for the server instead. So now when I call get user, I can do a simple check that says if user equals null, well, then I want to return an error that says user not authenticated or whatever, something like that. Now this is where I want to actually create a new client as well. So we can say const Supabase equals create client. Make sure I get this one from the server as well, just like that. And then we can use this to access our database. So we can say Supabase dot, and we can do things on our database. So let's say from, that's going to be the table that we want to do this on. We want to do this on the rooms table. Let me make sure here I wait up there. That way I don't need to do any awaiting down here. There we go. And from here, you'll notice I'm actually not getting any autocomplete because this should be chat room, I believe is what I called it, but we're not getting any autocomplete. So let's actually go ahead and fix that problem before we go ahead and finish out this section. So to get our TypeScript types, there's a few ways you could do it. You can copy them from the Supabase URL page, or you can use a little bit of a CLI that they have to generate these types for you. So we're going to install this Supabase type right here. This is just a library. We want to make sure this is a dev dependency. So we're going to put -d in front of that. We then need to call Supabase login to be able to log in. So if we just do that, that's going to log us in. I should already be logged in, but if not, I can come in here and I can just go over, copy over this code and paste it in. And now I'm going to be logged in and authenticated, which is great. And And then the final thing we need to do is just make sure, well, actually we don't need to worry about initting because we already have a project, but here we can generate our TypeScript types by calling this long function right here. Now I'm going to copy over the version that we're actually going to be using. It's very similar. We just changed around some of the variables. So if we go ahead and we look at this, what we want to do is we want to say Supabase gen types TypeScript, and then we need to pass it in our project ID. We can get that very easily by looking at our URL. Everything that comes before the .supabase, that's going to be our project ID. So we can just paste that in after project ID. Then we have a little pipe symbol here saying that we want to take the output of this command and put it inside of this file right here. And this is just inside our source services Supabase types database. And if we look at our code, source services Supabase, it's going to create a brand new folder here, which we're going to call types. And inside of there, it's going to put a database.ts file. So now if we run npx, actually it's just npm run gen types, that should hopefully go out to our Supabase project, figure out what all the TypeScript types are, and put them inside of this database TS file. As you can see here, we now have all of these different types that we can use, and they have this database file type right here, which inside of our project, we can just pass along as a generic right here. There we go. And now we get type safety on all of these. So let me do that on the server as well as on the client version. And if we do that and we go back into our action, we should see inside of here, I now have type safety for my chat room. And if we come in here and try to do an insert, again, I get type safety on all of that related information. So I want to add in my name, which comes from my data name, and my isPublic, which is data.isPublic, just like that. That's all the information we need to pass along to actually insert this into our database. I also want to select from here, essentially just the ID property. And I want to get a single one. So we can say .single, just like that. That's going to return to me some data, as well as a potential error, and we'll set that to awaiting this particular call, just like that. And I'm going to rename this to room, and I'm going to rename, our error to room error. There we go. So now I have my room, which you can see is just an ID or it's null, and then we also have this room error if we have some type of error. So down here, if our room error or our room is equal to null, we can just say failed to create room. There we go. Otherwise, we want to add the user to the room because they just created it. It makes sense that they become a member. And here we go. You can see it's already kind of wanting to do this for us. So we can say Supabase. We want to get it from that chat room member table. And we want to insert specifically a chat room ID, as well as here, this is our member ID to those particular pieces of information. And we don't even care about getting the information back from this. We don't need to worry about returning anything. We can just say, hey, if there's an error, then we can say failed to add user to the room. Otherwise, we don't even need to worry about returning anything. We can just redirect the user. So we can say redirect, get that from the correct location. And we want to redirect them to essentially this brand new room that they just created. So hopefully if we set up this action correctly and we go back into our application page for the room itself, and we just make sure we call that, which we called it create room, create room, just like that. Pass it in my data, await that. And we should be getting a response from here. So if we look inside of here, you can see we have an error as well as a message, and we can just render that out using a toast or something like that. So let's make sure we import from Shadcn the Sonner library. That's going to give us all the toast related stuff we need. Inside of our layout, we can use the toaster from Shadcn, and now we can use a toast. For example, here we can say if we have an error, then we want to call toast .error, and we can just pass it along whatever our message is. There we go. And let's just make sure we close everything off, give that a quick save, and that looks like that should be working. So let's actually test everything. Looks like I have some faulty imports maybe somewhere. I have some yellow underlining. Oh, that's just because it's telling me to use grow instead of flex grow. That's fine. Okay. So let's go back over to here. Let's refresh our page to make sure we have nothing cached. And we're just going to say my first room. And we're going to say that this is a public room, and we'll click create. And it looks like it failed to create the room. Now the reason for this may be a little confusing because if you look through our code, it's all actually going to be correct. But if we go over to Supabase, it'll become quite apparent why this is happening. What we need to do inside of our application, I'll just make this a little bit larger so it's easier to see. We want to go into our real-time app for the chat. Let's come into here, and we specifically want to mess with the authentication stuff. So we'll say explore auth, and inside of here, there's a policy section. And you can see right now we have no row level policies set up for any of our tables, which means if we as a user try to access any of these tables to insert or select data, it's always going to return to us either no data or an error if we try to insert, because essentially we have no permissions to do anything yet. Now, if I were to disable this row level security, just like that on my chat room, we should see that this will actually work. When I click create room, you can see it's actually still failing. Oh, it's failing to add the user to the room. It created the room, but then it failed to add me to the room because now it's trying to get to this chat room member table. And again, there are no permissions set up on here, so everything is denied by default. Now, this is something that's great on the client, but when you're on the server, oftentimes you want to override these permissions and just completely ignore them. This is why inside of our code, we're actually going to create a brand new section in our server here that's going to be a client server. So we can say export async function, create admin client, just like that. Now this admin client is going to be very similar to what we did over here. So let me just copy this code and paste it down. The only difference is we're not actually going to access the cookies. So this doesn't even need to be asynchronous. And the reason we're not accessing any cookie related information is because we're essentially not passing along the user's token. And here, instead of our public key, we're going to be using our Supabase secret key. So now we're essentially saying, hey, we are the server, we have this fancy secret key, and we're not going to be passing along our cookie stuff. So here, we're just going to return an empty array for our cookies, and we don't even worry about setting the cookies because nothing cookie related is happening on this admin client. We're not tracking the user or anything like that. We're just saying, hey, we are the secret user that has full access to literally everything. So now where I'm using the normal create client, I can use my create admin client instead. So let's go into that action. And here where I have create client, I want this to be my create admin client, just like that. And we can get rid of that old import since we no longer need it. And now let's come in here and actually create this as my second room since we already created the first room. And we can click create room, give that a second, and it looks like it's still failing to add the user to the room. Now let's look at the reasons why this could be. We can just scroll all the way down and we'll just do a console.error of our membership error to see what that is. We can go over, we can view our console, and we can just try to create a room. And now we can see here that what the problem is it's saying is not present in table user profile. Oh, obviously, we are currently linking our user profile table. So if we look at our authentication here, we have this user profile table. That's what we're linking to. But really, all of our different users are stored inside of a special table called auth. You can see auth table right here, auth.users. And if we look at that auth table, it has all of our user information, but specifically there's a users table right here, which is where our users are created. Essentially, when we create a user, we need to trigger something in our database to then go ahead and run a function to create a user inside of our public schema that we can use inside of our application for this user profile. Now we could manually go ahead and do this ourselves, but it's so much easier to actually use the Supabase MCP server to do this because writing these kinds of things is really a pain. So we're going to set up the Supabase MCP server inside of our project. All we need to do is come down here. We are using a hosted version. We can select our project, which is real-time chat. We can specify if we want it to be read-only and specify certain things, but in our case, we'll just leave it to have access to everything, which is okay for us because we're just doing this inside of development. If this was like your production application, maybe pare it back quite a bit. Let's copy over this URL. We're going to go to the VS Code settings, and we can see here, this is what we need to add into our .vs code /mcp.json. We can also just click the add to VS Code button. That's going to allow us to just automatically install this server. So we'll just give it a quick second, and you can see that it is now being added, and we'll just say that that's perfectly okay to be adding. We're going to authorize the access for all of this. So we'll say that we want to authorize them to be able to access all of our organization related stuff. And it's going to redirect us back to Visual Studio Code with that MCP server hopefully added inside of our project. Now with that done, we have the Supabase MCP server, but on its own, while it can do a lot, it's much better with certain prompt files being used. So that's why this Supabase UI library is really nice because they actually have a section for AI editor rules inside of prompts. You can see right now it's really only set up for Cursor, but it's super easy to convert this over to use in VS Code or really any other prompt-based AI agent you want to use. So we're going to install these real quick into our application. So we'll come over to here, and we'll make sure we just run that command real quick. That's going to install these all in like the cursor format. So if we look at our files, you can see we have these inside this cursor folder. I'm using VS Code with GitHub Copilot. So we're going to use these in the GitHub format. So essentially we just need to rename this folder here from cursor to .github. There we go. And then inside of here, we need to rename our rules. So we're going to say rules is going to change to prompts, because these are going to be used specifically as prompts. And then all we need to do is call .prompt at the end of this. So it'll say .prompt like that. And then we want it to be an MD file instead of an MDC file. So we can say .prompt for every single one of these. And these are just going to be really nice things that make it so that our Supabase knows how to work with Supabase. So the MCP server knows all the best practices on how to be able to create all the different things we want to do inside of Supabase. There we go. And they have ones for creating database functions, for creating real-time prompts, and so on. The real one we care about right here is database functions and role-level security policies. Those are the most important ones. Now to test this out, we can have the Supabase MCP server and our AI essentially create that trigger and everything for us. So what we can do is, since we want to create a database function, essentially a function that's going to run for us, we'll take this prompt right here for creating database functions and we'll drag it into our context, and then we'll paste in the command we're going to use. This command just says, I have a Supabase project with a public.userprofiles table. I want you to create a trigger that will create a new row in the public.userprofiles table whenever a user is inserted into the auth.user table. And it should go through. You can see it's already using the MCP server to get all of our different table names and trying to figure out what the table name is. And it should go ahead and ask us, hey, I want to run certain SQL on your thing to create all these different triggers for you. And if we go ahead, we can see right now it's asking to create essentially all of that. You could read through this if you want. I'm just going to click allow and let it go through, and then we'll look at the actual results of it once it finishes running. You can see here it says it's successfully created that trigger function for us. So let's look at our server code inside of here and see if it actually did what we expected it to do. So we can go ahead, we can look at our functions, and you can see we have a function for handle new user. And inside of here, you can see it's doing all of that complicated code for us. We may want to modify this slightly, but right now you can see it's doing all of that for us. And if we look at our triggers, we should see on the auth table, we have a trigger when a user is created. So after insert, it's going to call the handle new user function. So it set up our trigger and it set up our function for us. We just want to make sure we go back to that public table because that's where this is at. Now I'm going to modify this slightly to make sure it works with how we're doing things, which is with GitHub, because it has essentially certain things that are slightly different. For example, we know this is going to be our preferred username right here. That's the thing we want this to default to. And this avatar URL is fine. Also, it looks like it's correctly getting our ID property just like we wanted to. So let's just save that with our small change that we made to it. And that should hopefully be everything we need to do to set that up. And the nice thing is we didn't need to manually write that or create that. We just were able to let the MCP server do that for us. So let's actually see if this works. To test this, we first need to essentially delete our account and recreate our account. So back over here, let's go to authentication. I'm going to get my user and I'm just going to delete them and then recreate them essentially. So now back into our application, we should be logged out. There you go. Now if I sign in, you should see we can continue with GitHub and it should hopefully log us in. We have an error occurring though, it looks like. Let's just refresh our page, make sure we don't have any weird caching stuff going on. So let's do a refresh and we'll continue with GitHub to see if that works. And it looks like we're still getting an error. So most likely something inside of our database triggers is not quite working like we expect it to. Our function is probably getting some wrong data from it. Now the first thing we do is just clean this up. We already know preferred username is the only thing we care about. So we can essentially remove all of this other code that's not the preferred username. So let's just get rid of all of that. Get rid of that whole coalesce. We don't need any of that. Get rid of that. And this whole comment just to clean that section up. And we'll get rid of these spaces here. There we go. And we'll do the exact same thing down here. We know that all we care about is the avatar URL. So we can get rid of everything that isn't that URL. Make sure we put a comma after this. There we go. Close that off. And that hopefully just cleans this up because we kind of already know these are the only properties we care about since we're using the GitHub URL. And it looks like I need to remove this comma right here. And now I can save. And it looks like that'll save properly. So let's see if this actually works. Let's try to continue with GitHub to sign in. And it looks like we're still getting a little bit of an error. So I went and dug through the logs to try to figure out what the problem was. You can see permission denied for table. So we're getting a permission denied error when we try to save this information, which means that when we set up our database function itself, we are not using the correct security level. You can see we have the invoker security level. We need to change that to the definer security level. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to do that in the UI. We could do it through our own SQL statement, or we could just ask the AI to do this for us. We can say, please update the security level to definer. There we go. It should hopefully update that security level for us, and it'll ask us to run a simple SQL statement for that. Here's that SQL statement. I can just click allow on this. It's going to take a second to run, and hopefully once that finishes, if I refresh over here, we should see that it now has that definer security level, which is essentially a higher level that's needed to be able to write to these different tables. So now let's go ahead and try to sign in and continue with GitHub, and hopefully this time it'll actually work. You can see we've been redirected. We have our name right here, and the really great thing is now if I go into my database and I actually look at my tables, we can go to the table editor here and I go to my user profile. I should have a user profile right here which has my name and it has my image URL and all that other information for us. Now let's go back into our application and try to create a room. We'll just say this is my final room and we'll make this one a public room. Click create real quick. give it a second, and you can see we're being redirected to that room page, which means it actually created everything for us. And we should be able to see inside of here, we have a chat room. We have a couple of them, but if we refresh, we should hopefully see that my final room is inside this list as well. There it is, my final room right there. And if we look at the membership table, we have one membership between our chat room ID and our member ID, which links together that room and the account that we just created. So now let's go back to our application and actually finish out the page for our homepage here. So once we actually have rooms, I want to show them on our page. So let's kind of minimize out a lot of this, get our code a little bit cleaned up here, close out of all of these, minimize all this down inside of our app. We're going to go specifically to that page, and I want to create some new functions. So we can say here, we have an async function called get public rooms, and we're going to have an async function called get joined rooms, and these are just going to be the rooms that we are currently a member of. So get public rooms is going to be quite simple. First, I want to get my admin client because we're going to be doing this on the server, so it's perfectly safe to do the admin client way of doing things. Next, I want to get my data, and I want to get any error that I have from calling supabase.from. I want to get this from my chat room table. I want to select specific columns from this. So I want to get my ID column, my name column, and I want to call the chat room member section to get the count of the number of people that are inside of here. Then I can just say when is public is true that I want to get these, and I'm going to order them by their name, just like that, in ascending order. There we go. So we'll give that a quick save. That gives us all of our data, and we could just say, hey, if we have an error, then let's just return an empty array. Otherwise, we can return all of our data, and I'm just going to map out that data to give me an ID, a name, and the member count. And the member count is going to be coming from the first row inside of here because we're just getting the count. So it's just going to return to us one row, and that one row will have a count variable. So this will tell me how many people are in each one of our different rooms. Now we need to do a very similar thing for our joined rooms, but it's going to work slightly differently. Let's just paste that down. Now for our joined rooms, what we're going to do is we're going to get our member ID directly from here because we can't actually just do a simple join where we say, hey, where the member ID is equal to our current ID, because then we'll have no way to get how many members are in each room as well, because it'll only return to us the current member that we're logged in as. So what we need to do instead is just get all of the chat rooms, and we want to get the member ID for them, and again, sort them by name. If there's an error, just render out nothing. Otherwise, what we want to do is we want to do the same exact mapping, but here we want to do a filter first. We're going to filter only for the rooms where the chat room member ID has essentially a field for our user. So we can say sum where the u.member ID is equal to whatever our current member ID is, and we can just make sure we pass that in here. So we can say user ID is a string, and we'll just replace this with our user ID. There we go. So we're essentially only getting the rooms that we're currently a member of, and then here I just want to get the length of how many members there are in each room, because this is going to return to me an array for each one of our members. If we look at this, you can see it's an array of chat room members. So we just want to get essentially what the length of that is. That'll give us how many people are in that particular room. Now we can actually call these functions up here. I'm going to do that in a promise.all. So we can say right here, get public rooms, get joined rooms, and that's going to give us the data right there. Let's make sure this is an async function. And our user is equal to get current user. There we go. And let's make sure down here we use our user.id. And if for some reason our user is equal to null, then we just want to redirect the user to our auth page. There we go. Now we of course need to await this because this is an async function. And now we have our public rooms and our joined rooms. So the first thing I want to do is I want to say, hey, if my public room length is equal to 0 and my joined room's length is equal to 0, well, that means that there are currently no rooms at all that I have access to. So I want to return all of the code that we originally were returning before. Otherwise, I'll just return null. So right now you can see we're returning nothing because currently we have at least some public rooms. So we have access to that information inside of here. So here I want to return a div, and this div is going to contain essentially all of our different container classes. We can say container, mx auto, px4, py8, and space y8 to space everything out. And inside of here, we're just going to create a component called room list. It's going to have a title, your rooms, and then we're going to pass it along all of our rooms, which is the joined rooms, and a little flag that tells us, hey, this is the one that we currently are joined to. We're also going to create one for our public rooms, and we're not going to pass along is joined because we're not currently in those particular rooms. Also, we don't want to pass along any public rooms we're currently a member of, so we can just do a quick filter here. And the filter on this is just going to take our room, and if the room is part of our joined rooms, so we can say joined room.sum r.id is equal to room.id. There we go. Now we know that, hey, essentially if we are currently joined with this room, remove it from this list. So we can just put a little not in front of that to make sure we remove that from the list. So let's create that room list component. There we go. For now, it'll just return null, so at least we have our page will render. Our props for this are pretty self-explanatory. I'll copy them over. Our title is a string. Our room is just essentially the return from these down here, and is joined as an optional boolean that defaults to false. Now we'll get rid of all this code that was auto-generated inside of here. If our room length equals nothing, then we'll return null, just like that. Otherwise, we want to return essentially a bunch of content that's going to have a label, a button, as well as all of our different rooms. So we can say class name space y4. Then inside of this, we can have another div here, and this is going to be for our title section. So we're going to center all of our content, and we'll put a little bit of a gap in there as well. There we go. Next thing we're going to have is close off that div. Inside this div, we're going to have an h2. This h2 is going to have our title, and of course, we'll give it some classes. We'll say text to XL for this one. And then we're also going to have a button on the far side that's going to be for adding a room. So this will just be a link. And this will go to /room/new. There we go, create room. Give that a quick save. So now you can see we have our your rooms, create room, public rooms, create room. So that has all that content that we want, which is great. Next, I want to create a grid. So we can say class is grid, a gap of 4. Grid columns is going to be a repeat, autofill, min max of 250 pixels and 1 FR. So it'll just scale up in size. Make sure I get all that closed off properly. There we go. And inside of here, I want to just loop through all my rooms. And instead of rendering out some content like this, we'll make sure we close that off. There we go. And inside of here, I want to render out a room card component, which will create and pass along essentially all of our room related information. So you can see here, we pass along all of our room related information, as well as a key, which is just our room.id. And we'll pass along that is joined property as well to determine if it's a room we can join or not. So let's create that room card just like that. We have our ID, our name, our member count is joined, and we'll make sure we get the props for those as well. That's just all the content we're passing into here. And for now, if we just return null, we should hopefully see everything on our page renders still. Inside of our room, we want this to be a card, so we can get that card component just like that. Inside of here, we're going to have a card header. Inside of that, we're going to have our card title, which is just the name of the room. We're then going to have our card description, which is our member count. There we go. And we want that to render member count is equal to 1, then it renders member, otherwise it renders out members. So it'll tell us, hey, this room has 1 member, this one has 0, this one has 0, this one has 0. So you can see how many members are in each one of our different rooms, which is great. Also, what we want to do is after our card header, we want to have our card content. I'm going to give this one a gap of 2. There we go. And then inside of here, I essentially want to have just 2 different buttons. So this first one is going to be if is joined. If we are currently joined into this room, I want to render out this fragment that's going to have the 2 buttons, 1 button for entering the room and 1 button for leaving. So you can see we already have our enter button. I'll just change this to say enter. Our variant, we don't need to have a variant on here. We can just say, hey, this is going to be the full width one, which we'll just set to flex grow. It'll probably yell at me to just use grow instead. And then for this one, we're going to have a button for leaving the room. So we'll call this leave room button because this is going to need to be a client component. Room ID is our room ID. We'll make it a small button. And the variant on this one is destructive. And for this, we'll also make it a size of small as well. Now this leave room button doesn't exist, but if I just comment this out, we should hopefully see. If I just come in here, render out null, and make sure my card content is imported, that hopefully everything on our page will render. You can see we have our enter button, and when I click it, it brings me to that room page. So that is at least working like we expect it to. Now I'm actually going to change this out for a card footer instead, because that's going to give us the proper styles we want. That should hopefully make this button full width. And then when we have that other button, it'll show up next to that. Now here, we want to have a join room button. So we're going to say join room button. That's going to take in our room ID. It's going to grow. The variant on this one is going to be outline, and then we can just create what these actual buttons do. So let's comment both of these in. And first we'll start with the join room button. So we can do that inside of our components. We'll create a new one called join room button.tsx, and I think I called it button, just like that. There we go. export function join button. This is actually going to use another one of those built-in components that I have in my own library. So we'll just say add at wds/action button. Again, you can get these components yourself by using this exact same command. And this is a button that just runs some server action for us, handles all the loading states and everything and the errors just like we want it to. So you can see it created all those different files for us. And inside of here, we can just say return action button, just like that. And inside of our action button, we can pass it whatever we want. For example, we could pass it join room or whatever. In our case, we'll have some children we pass along. So here we'll get our children, which is a React node. There we go. And then we also need to be passing along any additional props we want to take in, as well as our action, which we'll call join room. And this is just essentially a function that we want to call. So we can say async function join room, just like that. And that's what we're going to pass along as our action. Now for the type for our props up here, we actually just want to get these pretty easily. This is going to take in a room ID. So we're going to have a room ID, which is a string. And this children prop, we're going to automatically infer by using component props. I want to get these from the type of our action button, just like that. Add in that little ampersand symbol. There we go. Make sure I get this imported properly. That's going to give us all the different props that we need to get for our action button. So if we come in here and we spread out our props, that'll be all of our additional props. The only thing is I want to make sure we omit the action prop because I don't want that to accidentally get passed along since we're handling that ourselves. There we go. Now we just need to make sure we create this action, and this action essentially returns to us a promise that has an error, true, false, and it has a message that is a string. So we can do that relatively easily. Inside this join room function, the first thing that we want to do is use our user information. So we can say const user is equal to use current user, just like that. And to do that, we need to make sure that this is a client component. There we go. Then what we can do inside of our join room is we can say that if our user is equal to null, then we can just return some type of error to the user. So we can say error is true. And the message here, user not logged in, that's perfectly fine. Otherwise, we want to get our Supabase client. So we can say create client. Whoops, make sure we get the client version, not the server version, because we are on the client. And then we can call supabase.from. And I want to do the chat room member. And I want to insert specifically saying that my chat room ID is my room ID, my member ID is my member ID. So there we go. We're just inserting a brand new row into our database table. And we can say that we want to make sure there's no errors. So we can just do a simple await on that to check for any errors. And if we have an error, well, then we can just return an error that is true. And the message will just be a generic message, failed to join server or room. There we go. Since we called these rooms, not servers. And then if it was successful, I want to just use my router to refresh my page. And I want to push us to that room and then return that there was no error. So up here, we can say const router equals use router. There we go. And that cleans all that up. And you can see we now have no errors. And the nice thing about this action button component is essentially handles all of the different props. So if we have an error, it's going to send a toast for that. It starts a transition, handles our loading state. All of that's automatically handled for us. So here, our join room button, that is completely done. You can see it's working just fine. Now I'm actually going to copy this component because our leave room is going to be very similar to this. So we'll say leave room button, just like that. All the props are essentially exactly the same in our leave versus join. Obviously, we'll rename this to leave instead of join, just like that. Failed to leave room, there we go. And for this one, we don't want to do an insert. Instead, we want to do a delete, and we want to do some equal checks on here. So we want to make sure the chat room ID and the member ID are correct. There we go. So we're going to do a delete where these two equalities are checked. Make sure we have no errors. And if we have no errors, we can just refresh the page as is. We don't need to redirect the user anywhere at all. So now we can come in here with our leave button, and hopefully we should see everything working properly. I just want to make sure my leave button has some text in it because right now it's empty, and we can just make it say leave. There we go. So now if I click enter, it redirects me to the room. That works like we expect it to. Also, our join button should have some text inside of it. We'll say join. There we go. So now you can see if I click join, it should hopefully join me to that page, but right now we have a failure. And the reason for that is if we go back to our page and we check our policies, we'll notice that we have no policies right now on our chat room, which means everything is denied by default, we need to add policies for users to be able to add themselves as members. So this chat room member needs to have certain policies. Now we could write these policies ourselves, but they're kind of a pain to write. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use AI to do this for me with that MCP server. This is what makes working with Supabase so much nicer now. Now to do this, what we want to do is create a brand new chat window. So I'm just going to click new, and we also want to drag in the row level security policy prompt. And then we're just going to run this prompt. I'll read it to you. It just says add row level security policies to the chat room member table so that users can remove themselves from rooms, add themselves to public chat rooms, and read their own membership rows. And I also said you'll need to add a policy to the chat room table so users can read all public rooms. Because essentially we're going to have a link that is linking one table to another. So we're going to allow this real quick, let it run. But essentially this chat room member is going to reference the chat room. And if they don't have access to the chat room, it's going to throw a bunch of different errors for us. So let's go ahead and refresh and see if it actually added those policies for us. You can see here users can join public rooms. If we look at this, it's selecting on that chat room ID and getting all the chat rooms that are public. So that looks correct. Next thing we can look at is users can leave rooms. They can delete anything that they're currently a member of. That looks correct. And users can read their own memberships. Same thing, that looks like it's correct. And finally, users can read public rooms. Is public equals true? That looks correct as well. So it looks like it created all those policies for us. And it's nice we didn't have to write those by hand because they're super easy to mess up and a huge pain to debug. With that done, we now should hopefully be able to join a room. So let's just refresh our page, make this a little bigger, and let's join my first room. If we join, it redirects us back to that room page. And now if we go back to here, you can see we're a member in that my first room page. If we were to leave the my first room page, it just refreshes and moves it back down to this public room section. So now that we have this working, let's actually work on making the room page itself exist and work. So let's close out of all of this to make our code a little bit easier to read. Close out of everything that we currently have open. There we go. Minimize that. And now inside of our source app, we're going to go inside of rooms. We're going to create a brand new folder in the ID section, just like that. And we'll create a page in here. Export default function room page. And we can just return null. And now it's returning nothing on our page. First, we're going to want our params. Params right here is going to be a promise. Going to wrap all this content just like that. There we go. So now we have all of our params, and we can, for example, get our ID by awaiting those params as long as this is an async function. Now I specifically need to get a few different things from here. I need to get all of the different room information, what's the name of the room and so on. I need to get all the messages for the room, as well as I need to get the name and the image ID for the user that we're currently logged in as. So what I can do is I can come into here and I can say that I want to create an async function for getting my room, which takes an ID. I then want to essentially do the exact same thing for creating a function for get user and one for get message. There we go. Get user just like that, and get message just like that. It's going to be messages, and this is going to take in, again, our room ID as a string. And inside of get room, we need to get the user specifically to make sure they have access. So we could say get current user. And I think I actually am going to modify this function slightly. Right now, it's not being cached at all. I want to cache this instead. So we're going to export a constant variable called this, which is going to be set equal to this async function. There we go. And this is just going to be called by wrapping it in cache. So we can say cache, and this cache comes from React. There we go. And this will just make sure that if we call this function multiple times in the same render, it only actually calls it one time, which is great because we're going to be calling it multiple places inside of our code. For example, we're going to be using it here to get our user as well. But for now, we can just say, hey, if our user is equal to null, we can return null, and then we can get the room. So we can say Supabase, we want to get the admin client because we're doing this on the server, so it's okay for us to use the admin version of it. I then want to get our data, which is our room, as well as our error, by calling await Supabase, and I want to get this from the chat room, just like that. When I select data from here, I want to get the ID, the name, and I want to get the chat room members. There we go. I want to do an inner join on this so I don't get a bunch of data that I don't need, and I don't even need to select anything from this at all. The only reason I'm doing this inner join is to make sure that the member is an actual member of this. So we can say the chat room member dot member ID. We just want to make sure that that is equal to our user ID. Then we're going to be getting a single room from there. If we have an error, we will return null. Otherwise, we return our room just like that. And that's all the code we need to get our room. And again, the only reason I'm doing this inner join right here is to make sure that I have a membership row inside that table. So now what we can do is we can say const room user promise.all. We can say get room, get user, and we might as well say get messages as well and get our messages up here. Now let's go ahead and do get user next. This one's going to be quite simple for us to do. We want to get our Supabase client again. So we can say Supabase is getting our admin client. We want to come from the user profile table. There we go, the user profile table. We want to get the ID, the name, and we want to get the image URL just like that. And we want to get them from our user. So we can say here, if our user is equal to null, then we return null. Makes sense. Right here, we're checking to make sure the user ID is correct. Return a single thing from here. And of course, if we have an error, we want to return null. So this is just getting our user information. And then finally, we can get all of our message information, which is going to be pretty similar to what we've done inside of all of these different sections. The main difference is we don't really need the user in this one because we're just getting all of the messages. So we can get from our message table, just like that. I want to get it equal to where my chat room ID is equal to my room ID. And then we can specify what we want to get. I want the ID, I want the text, I want the created at, I want the author ID, and then I want to get a bunch of information about the author. There we go. And the author specifically references the user profiles table. So we're going to write that out here, telling it what table to look at. And at this table, I want to get the name and I want to get the image URL. So just essentially all the information I need to render out the message. What is the name of the message or the text of it and who sent that message? There we go. We can order these as well. So I'm going to say we want to order them by created at in ascending order equal to false. So we get the newest messages first. And then we can put a limit on here of, let's say, 100. That's the way we can set up infinite scrolling and so on. And that way we don't load all the messages all at once. Now, if we have an error for this one, I'm going to return an empty array. Otherwise, I'm just going to return all my data as is. So now we get our messages, our users, as well as our room, and we have access to all of those up here. But of course, to do all this real-time stuff, we need to do it on the client. So we're going to essentially just push all this information down to our client. So we can say here, room client, which is a brand new component we're going to create. We're going to pass along the room, the user, and the messages. And if for some reason our room or our user is null, well, then I want to just return not found because essentially the user is either not logged in or they don't have access to this page. Now for this room client, I can come into here. I can create a brand new file called client.tsx. This is going to be a client component. And I can export that room client just like that. And we need our room, our user, and our messages. And our props for this, our user is just going to be an ID, a name, which is always there, and an image URL, which is sometimes not there. Our room is going to be a name, as well as an ID. There we go. And then finally, our messages. This one is going to be a brand new type. So we'll just come out here with a type because we're going to use this in a ton of different places. So we'll just create a message type like that. And we're going to say that this is a message array. There we go. Now this message type is mostly going to be used on our actual server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, I'm going to put it inside of a new file in our actions called messages.ts. And I'm going to put the type right here. And this type is going to have an ID, which is a string, text, which is a string, created at, author ID. It's going to have our author. And the author is going to have a name and an image URL. So that's all the stuff related to our message. We can just export that from here. We'll come back and add more stuff into here later. But now you can see that that gives us access, oops, if I import the correct one, to all of our message related content. And if I just return null, hopefully that'll clean up our errors as long as we just import this right here. And of course, our messages has some problems with it. It's just saying that it can't find all the relationships. Let's scroll down and it looks like the data is here. Could not find the relationship between message and user profiles. That's because I called it user profile, not user profiles. Now my data is the correct type. And if we scroll up here, that is correct as well. Now let's go into our room client and just get an overall rough outline of what our page is going to look like. We'll make this a little bigger so it's easier to see. And inside of here, we of course need to have our div. That is going to be our container, mx auto. The height is going to be that screen without the header height included. We're going to use a border and no border on the top or the bottom, and then flex and flex column. There we go. If we give that a quick save, you'll really notice no big changes. But if we expand out our page, you can see that we have these nice little borders on the right and the left-hand side on a larger screen size. But on smaller screen sizes, you just can't really see that. Then what we want to do is add in another div. This one's going to have a class name here of P4. And the border is going to be on the bottom. And this is essentially where we're going to put our channel title for our room. So we can come into here with an H1 that has our room name, just like that. Make sure that I close off all of these properly. Give that a quick save. And now you can see it says my final room. And I like the styling that it has on there, which is fine. Then we're going to have a P tag. And this is going to tell us how many connected users we have. So connected users is a variable we'll create in a little bit. But for now, I might as well just comment that out. And we'll just put 0 users or 0 online. There we go. And actually, it should probably say users. So there we go, 0 users online. Let's add in text muted foreground and text small onto that so it could just tell us how many people are currently logged in at the current time. But of course, we'll need to come back. So we'll just add a to-do, make real data. There we go. Now, after all of that, we can come down here and I essentially want to add a button. And this is going to be the invite user modal, just like that. We'll close that off. And this will take in the room ID. This is essentially going to be a button that invites the user to our page. But to make sure everything is spaced out properly, we need to wrap this inside of a div, flex items in the center, justify between, and a gap of 2. And we'll just wrap these 2 different pieces of content. And then we can come down here with the function invite user modal. And for now, we'll just return null. There we go. So at least I can comment this back in, and now it's working as we expect, and it should put a button over here once we implement that modal. Now the next section after this entire thing is going to be where we render all of our chat messages. And this is going to be a little bit of a complicated piece of code. So first of all, I want this to grow, so we can just use that grow class. It's going to fill the full height. And I want this to scroll, so our overflow Y is going to be auto. So if it's overflowing, there we go. And then we're going to put a flex column reverse on here, and I'll explain why in just a second. But essentially what we want to have happen is when we type in a message and we click send, we want to automatically scroll to that message that we just sent if we're already scrolled to the bottom of our page. If we're scrolled somewhere else, we don't want to scroll to the bottom. But if we send a message and we're scrolled to the bottom, we want it to automatically scroll to that page. And the way that the scroll bar works inside the browser is if you're scrolled to the top of a box and something gets added to the top of that box, it'll scroll you to the new top of the box. By using flex column reverse, we essentially flip our box upside down. So if we're scrolled to the bottom of the box and something gets added to the bottom, it's going to essentially assume that we want to scroll to the bottom of the box for that new content. So instead of having to write fancy JavaScript code, we just have one central line of CSS that's going to handle that scrolling for us. And I'll show you when we get to that point what this looks like. I'll just add a little to-do demo comment so I can demonstrate why we have this and what it does. But of course, we don't want to actually flip the order of the content inside of our list. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a single div that we wrap all of our messages in. So essentially we're putting this one div in reverse order, which flips our scroll bar orientation, but all of our messages are still in the correct order because they're inside this div that's no longer reversed. So nothing actually gets reversed. The only thing that gets reversed is the way our scroll bar works when it's trying to automatically scroll for us. Now inside of here, I want to loop through all of our different messages. So we're just going to put a quick little map on our message. There we go. Make sure we close that out. And I want to render out a chat message, which is just a component that we're going to create, key like that. And we're going to pass along all of our message props by just saying message like that. There we go. And we can close off that chat message. And for now, we'll just say function chat message. We don't even worry about props. We'll just say return null. There we go. It'll give us a little error, but it's okay. It's perfectly fine. Now, the final thing we need to do is to make sure our scroll bar actually works properly. So we can come into here and I can add a style. We're just going to make our scroll bar a little bit less apparent. So we can come in here with our scroll bar width and we can set that to thin to make our scroll bar a little smaller. And we can modify our scroll bar color. And we want this one to be our border color. So we'll say var border. And transparent so it doesn't have that big bold background showing on it. So it's just going to be a really small little scroll bar. You'll see that once we start adding our messages. Finally, after this section, we need to add the chat input. And this is where we actually add in our chat by typing into this input field. And this chat input needs to take in our room ID. So we're going to pass it in our room.id, just like that. Now, the first thing I want to implement is this chat input because that's the most important thing. We can't really do anything else without this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a brand new component for that. So inside of our component section, we'll just create a chat input.tsx, export that function just like that. We'll return null. And inside of here for our props, we'll get in that room ID. Now we're going to be using a fancy input component. So we can come in here from Shadcn and use the input group. This is just allowing us to add a fancy input component that can have like buttons directly inside of it. There we go. We have that added. So now inside of here, let's actually return what we want. We want to have a form, obviously. So let's get our form. Inside of that form is where we're going to have that input group component. And inside of here, we can have an input group text area. This is going to allow us to have essentially a text area component, and we can just make this self-closing. There we go. Then below our input group, we can have an input group add-on. This is allowing us to add that button onto our page. So we can say input group button, and this is where we want to put our button. This is going to just have the send icon. And this is essentially going to be a button we can click on our page to do that stuff. So inside of here, let's get our chat input imported. So at least our page will render over here Right now, it's not really showing anything because all of this is completely blank. But if we look at the very bottom and I hide this right here, we can just say that we want to hide this. You can see we have that input showing up. Now my add-on, I want to be on the left, or on the right, sorry. So we can say align, and we want that to be inline end. There we go. So that's going to push that over to the right-hand side. We also need to do quite a bit of styling on the form itself. So we can say P3 to just pad that so it's inside here. So we can see that that's been inside. Also for our text area, I want the field sizing on this to be content. So it'll grow with the size of my content. And I'll set the min height to auto, again, so it's as small as possible. So as I type inside of here, the more content I put, it's going to automatically grow because of that field sizing content, which is an awesome CSS class. Now let's finish out what our button is going to do. We want this button to be a submit button. We also want an area label on this button, and that's just going to say send. And we also want the title on this to be send, just for some accessibility. And the size of this is going to be icon small, since it's a small icon that we want to have. Now for our input text area, this is going to be a little bit more complicated because essentially we need to store a bunch of information. So we can say here, placeholder, type your message. That's perfectly fine. We need to pass along our value, which is just message. So it's coming here, const message, set message is equal to use state, which is an empty string by default. There we go. Then we can add an on change just like that. So you can see setting the message with the on change. There we go. Make sure I get all of this proper. Now the final thing I want to be able to do is when people are typing in here and they hit enter, I want it to submit instead of actually going to a new line. So we can just say on key down, I want to run some code. And the code for this is just going to say if the e.key is equal to enter and they are not holding the shift key, then what I want to do is I want to prevent the default behavior and I want to handle submit. So we can say handle submit, which is a function that we can create up here. There we go, which is just going to submit our form for us, and we can pass along anything we want into this handle submit. Also, we should use our on submit here with handle submit being passed along. There we go. And this is going to take in a form event just like that, or it's going to be not passed along. So we can say that this is an optional field just like that. And we can prevent the default. There we go. Because here we're not going to be passing along any form data to be able to prevent. So now we can just say, hey, here we go. If we prevent the default, if we don't have a message, then we completely return. Otherwise, what we want to do is we want to save this message on the server. So we can say await send message. That's going to be a function we create, which we pass along our text, which is our message, and our room ID just like that. We should also probably trim this message. So we can just say const text is equal to message.trim. There we go. And then we can just use text all these places. Make sure that's an async function. And this will return to us essentially our result that has that error and so on. So we can say if result.error, then we can toast.error, our result.message. There we go. Make sure we import that properly. Otherwise, we can do whatever else we want to do inside of here. We can just handle that later. So we want to create essentially send message. If we go back over in our code in that action section, we can create a function called send message that does exactly that. And this send message should take in those props. We have text and we have room ID just like that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just get my user, which is just await get current user. If my user is equal to null, we'll return an error that says that they need to be authenticated. Next thing that we'll do is we'll just check to see if our data is correct. We'll just call this data up here. So if our data.text.trim, if that is not true, essentially that means that we have no data at all. It's not properly being passed along. We can just say message cannot be empty. Finally, we can then use Supabase to create our client, and this is going to be an admin client. There we go, because we're on the server, so we can do that. And I want to get my error as well as my data related content, and I want to insert into that table the text, the room ID, and then the author ID, which comes from our user. I also want to make sure that I trim my text to make sure it's as short as possible. Also, before I insert this data, I probably want to make sure that they are a member of the room. So what I can do inside of here, I can rename data to message or something like that. There we go. Give that a quick save. Also, I need to make sure that this is chat room ID to clean up those different errors. So that cleans up all those errors. Now I can do that check to see if they are actually a member. So we can say const data, which is membership, and an error. And let's just see what this is trying to get for us. First of all I care about is the member ID. I don't really need any fields. I want a single one where the chat room ID and the member ID are equal. And then we can say if we have a membership error or that we don't have the membership, then I can return an error that user is not a member of the chat room. So first I'm checking to make sure that they're a member of the room, and then I'm allowing them to add this message for us. Then if we have some type of error, I can just say there was a failure to create this. Otherwise, I can return to us that there was no error, and I can return down our data as a message. So we can just say data, just like that, which is going to be our message. And we can just call this message. That's perfectly okay. Now, to make sure this works properly, we're going to need to type this. So I can say that my error is false, then it's going to return to me a message. Otherwise, if my error is not false, it's going to return to me a message that is a string. And there we go. And it looks like, to make sure that this works properly, I need to get a select from here. So we can say select, and we can specify all the content we want to select. So we want to get the ID, the text created at author ID, essentially all that data that we got before. We want to get the exact same data and pass that along as the message property. That gives us everything we need. And if we export this, we should be able to import this here. And now we're actually sending along the message. And here, our result.message is equal to that message that has all of our different properties on side of it. Now it looks like I'm getting a bit of an error from trying to import something from this server file inside of my rooms ID page. So let's go to the page here. Looks like I'm importing something that it is not really happy about me importing. So let me just try getting rid of that import, re-importing it. And let me make sure that my chat input, this actually probably is the problem. This should be a client component. There we go. And our messages here, this should be server. So we'd say use server. There we go. That looks like it cleaned up all the different problems we had. And now we can see here that if I type in some message and I click enter, it should hopefully send that message along. Now, when we send the message, we should probably clear out our input. So let's just come all the way up here and make sure that we clear out our input immediately whenever we do anything. So we can say set message to an empty string, just like that. So the very first thing we do right before we send our message is we clear it out. So if we type something else and we click enter, you can see it clears it out. But of course, it's not showing up because we're not doing any real-time stuff yet. But if I refresh, hopefully that actually shows up on our page as 2 messages. Now, I don't see anything yet, but that's because right now my chat message is just rendering blank. What I could do, though, is I could get these properties. So let's just say here that we have our message, which is our message like that. I believe that's not how I actually passed it in, though. It's going to be this. There we go. And now I can just say message.message. Whoops, not message.message. There we go. Message.text, sure. And now if we save, you can see there's the text for my messages. It's obviously super ugly, but let's go ahead and style what our chat message looks like to make this look a little bit better. I'm gonna just bring this into its own component to make it a little bit easier to work with. So we're gonna go into our components, chat message, export that chat message. I guess I already have all the code for it. There we go. Let's make sure we import message just like that. And then inside of here, we can import that chat message if I export it properly. There we go. Import chat message, and I think I imported the wrong message component here. There we go. So now we have our message text and everything's rendering the same as before. Obviously, I want this to be quite a bit different though. Let's make sure we use a div inside of here. And for the class name on this div, I want it to be flex with a gap of 4. I want it to be px of 4. Whoops. Px of 4, py of 2 to give it some spacing. And when I hover over this, I want the background to be my accent background, but I want it to be 50% transparent. There we go. Next thing that I want to do is I can just put the text inside of here, say message. I might as well break this out. So we say text, just like that, text. And hopefully now you can see when I hover these rows, at least they have some content being shown inside of them. Obviously I want to make this much more complex though. So let's come in here with a div, a class name of flex shrink 0, because I don't want this to shrink down at all. And it's telling me that I can rename this to shrink 0. So let's do that. There we go. Next thing that I want to do, this is where I want to render my image. So I can say author, which we can get from here. Author, there we go. I want to get the image URL specifically from it. And if this is not equal to null, then what I want to do is I want to render out the image component from Next.js. So let's get that image component from Next. And I want to render out the source, which is my author.image URL. The alt is going to be the author name. And then we have width and height. That looks pretty good. There we go. And I should also add a class name to this, which is rounded full. So it's going to be a full circle. This should just say null. And at least now we have our image showing up. We are getting an error because we need to make sure we add this to our next config, but we'll get to that in a second. Next thing I want to do is a fallback in case there is no image. I want to show essentially the user to icon as a placeholder. This is going to have a class name of a size of 40 pixels as well. There we go. And actually, let's do 30 pixels. No. We want to do, we'll do 30 for this one, and we'll do 40 for the wrapper. So here, the size for this one will be 40 pixels. There we go. And then we can just add a little bit of margin on the top to push this down just so it shows at the very bottom of our icon. Trust me, it'll look really good once we get to what we want. Now what we can do is we can say rounded full, flex, items, center, justify, center, border, background, muted, text muted foreground, and overflow hidden. There we go. And this is probably telling me to use size 10 instead, so we'll just change that to size 10. There we go. Give that a quick save, and now let's go ahead and add this content into our Next.js config. So we'll just minimize all this down in our Next.js config, and all we need to do is configure images for this URL right here, just specifying, hey, these URLs are okay, and this is the path name for them, so that you can see it's now rendering out the URL for my image, or it's rendering out the image for that URL. Now, if I go to my chat message and I say here, hey, if the image URL is null, it's going to render our fallback instead. So you can see that's what our fallback looks like if we don't have an image, and it looks relatively good. We can actually probably change this to like 2.5, push that down a little bit more just to get all that clipping like we want it to. Now let's change this back to not equal. There we go. And below this, we can work on the text for our message. So this is going to be broken into two sections. This one I'm going to call flex grow just to make sure it fills the full space. There we go. And we'll do a space Y of 0.5 just to add a very small amount of space between our text and our header. So we're going to have our header, and then below that, we're going to have our text. Now the text here is going to be a paragraph tag, just like that. And then of course, I have my header at the top, and this paragraph tag is going to have a class of text small, break words, there we go, and white space is going to be pre. And we'll just change this to wrap break words because it's just giving me a little bit of a warning. And the reason we have right space pre here is because if I type in a message, again, let me get rid of this Next.js stuff that we don't want. Preferences, hide that completely. You can see if I add a bunch of spaces and I click send and we refresh our page, it's showing those white spaces for us, which is exactly what we want. Also looks like our messages are showing in reverse order. We'll fix that when we get to that point, but I want to focus on our header. We're going to add a class of flex. Items in this one are going to be baseline with a gap of 2, and then we essentially want to put our two pieces of text. So we'll put these inside of spans. First one is going to have a text of small and a font of semi-bold, and that's going to be where we put the name of the author. And then we can actually put the date down here. So this text for this one is going to be extra small, text muted foreground. This should say small, just like that. And then we can change how we're going to style our date. I'm going to come up here with a date formatter. That's going to be a new INTL date formatter, started out as undefined, and we'll just set short for both our date and our time style. So now we can use our date formatter and format that date, which we can get from here as created at. So we can just put created at right inside of there. And now if I save, you can see we get the date being passed along for exactly when I'm sending these messages. Now that's pretty much everything we need for each of our chat messages. We can go back to our client though, and when we render out our messages, we're going to render that out in a reversed order, just because essentially to make sure we get the messages in the correct order, we need to make sure that we have the oldest message as the first one, but we want the oldest message to be the last one in our list. So if we render those in reversed order, you can see that that gives us the correct order of our messages. So now that we're rendering our messages and everything's looking good, it's about time that we actually make these messages real time so I don't have to manually refresh the page every single time. So let's create a function called use real-time chat. And this use real-time chat function is going to take in our room ID as well as the user ID. And we'll just get those props. Room ID, user ID, there we go. And what I want to do is I want to store a bunch of information. The main thing is going to be our channel. And this is going to be using the real-time chat channel directly from the Supabase library. There we go. And we'll just default that to undefined to start. And then we're going to get a use effect. And this use effect is going to be where we put all of the code for hooking up real time. So let's get our Supabase client. That is create client, just like that, from the client version specifically. And then I can get a new channel, which is equal to supabase.auth, or not auth, sorry, channel. And our channel is going to be whatever we want to call it. In our case, our channel is going to be room, and then we're going to put a colon, followed by the room ID, followed by a colon, followed by messages. That is going to be the name of the room that we create. You can call it whatever you want. It's just important we have the room ID in there. Then for our channel, we can specify some options. Inside of our config, the very first option I want to specify is private is true. This is a private room which requires specific permissions to be able to access. Otherwise, anyone could paste in this as their channel and access messages from other channels. We obviously don't want that. We only want them to access messages they have permission to access. Next, we want to set up the presence, and we can set the key for this to user ID. Essentially, presence is how we track who is inside of channel and who's not in the channel. And by setting the key to the user ID, it means that if this user is on the exact same chat message on 10 different windows, it only counts as one user being online and not 10 different users being online. That's what this key does right here. Now, speaking of presence, the thing that I want to track is going to be the presence first. So we can say on, and we can specifically say on presence. What we want to do is we want to get the event, and the event is the sync event. So anytime that we have to sync the presence, so anytime someone leaves or joins, this event will be called right here, and it's going to be passing us along no information, but we can use this to actually get the information we want. So we can say new channel.present state, and that's going to give us the state that we want. Now, right now, we don't really have a way to use this information because we don't know what this state's going to confer. You can see it's just a bunch of different data that's completely empty right now. We don't know what this state is. So to be able to determine what that state is, we need to pass along some information to be able to be tracked by our users. So we want to add on a section here for subscribe. So we can say subscribe just like this. This is going to pass along a status. And essentially, whenever we try to subscribe to this room, we're going to get a status. If the status is not equal to subscribed, well, then we're just going to return and do nothing. But if it is equal to subscribed, well, that means we're currently subscribed to this channel. So we can say new channel.track, and we can essentially track our user ID. And this is what's going to be passed along inside of our present state. Our present state is going to be a bunch of objects where the key of the object is this presence key right here. And the value is whatever we pass along here. So it's going to be an array of all the essentially user IDs that are associated with that. We don't really care about any of these values or anything. All we care about is how many people are in this though. So we can say object.keys to get all of the keys for this particular present state. So how many people are connected. We get the length of that, and that tells us how many people are in our channel. And we can track that up here by saying connected users and set connected users. And if I make sure I spell all of that properly, we can come down here and we can set our connected users equal to that. And by default, we'll set this to 1 as our default value, just because by default, you're in the chat. So there's always going to be at least one person connected to this chat. Now, finally, once we're done with all of our channel related stuff, we can minimize that down. We can say set channel, just like that, pass it in our new channel. And then we can say we want to rerun this anytime our room ID or our ID changes. That works exactly like we expect it to. Looks like I am getting a little bit of an error here. So it stakes synchronously. Looks like I need to make sure all this is in my use effect. Looks like it is all in the use effect. Well, the nice thing is we don't actually care about tracking this channel property. So we can just remove this state here. We're not actually going to use it in the rest of our application. But if we did want to use it, I would recommend just moving this up into here. This would actually get rid of the error. So if we just go back to the code we had before and I move this up into here, now you can see the error is removed. But in our case, we don't really actually care about checking that. So I'm just going to remove it just to make this a little bit easier to understand. Lastly, we want to come in here with a return to just make sure we stop tracking all of the information. So we can say new channel dot untrack. So that essentially is going to do the exact opposite of track. It's going to say, hey, we have left this room. And then we can say new channel.unsubscribe to make sure we stop listening to things like presence changes and so on. So this is just going to make sure we handle all of our presence stuff as well as real-time messages when we get to that point. Now here I can return my connected users as well as the messages, which we can create state for up here. We can say const messages is going to be a message array, which is going to be by default an empty array, but we'll fix that later. We'll come up here and we can use our real-time chat. So we can say const get all of our information is equal to use real-time chat, pass it along our room ID and our user ID, and we can get our connected users from there. So now we can actually use that connected users data in the section up here where we had our to-do to make it real. We can come in here and we can say connected users, and we can also make sure that here, if our connected users equals 1, it says user, otherwise it says users. So that is going to make the data real. And now hopefully we can check to see if this works by trying to connect to this room with another user. So I just logged into a completely different GitHub account I have. This one's called Web Dev Simplified Test, as you can see, and we're going to be entering this my final room. So I'm just going to click join, and we should hopefully see that this updates to 2 and this updates to 2, but it looks like they don't. And the reason for this is again because of permissions. We have set this as a private channel. If I come back over to our code and we scroll all the way down to where we set this up, we set it up as a private channel. And a private channel requires us to set up permissions inside of our code. And right now we don't have any permissions. If we go to our real-time section for policies, you can see there are no policies currently on this section at all. Now to create those policies, we're again going to be using AI because it makes it super easy with that MCP server. You can see the prompt I said is to create row level security policies for the real-time messages table in Supabase. I'm just going to allow this while I read the rest. Users should be able to insert their presence for rooms they're members of, read presence updates for rooms they're members of, and receive message broadcasts for rooms they're members of. And the channel naming schema is, and that's just the naming that we called this particular channel. And the reason I allowed them to receive message broadcast is because we want to be able to send and receive these real-time messages as well, and that's what that final section is for. And I made sure to pass along that row level security policy prompt. So it looks like it went ahead and actually did that. So let's refresh our page and see if this looks correct. And it looks like it actually didn't create those policies. So I can just say, create those policies with the MCP server. And let's check to see where it said it actually did it. If we look at this, it looks like it's probably doing it on the wrong table. And actually, it looks like it just didn't do it at all. So let me just tell it to do that. It just gave me the code for it, but I wanted to create those using the MCP server instead of me manually doing it myself. So I let it run a little bit. It went ahead and it created these different policies for us. And it looks like if we take a look at these policies, and I make this a little bit larger for us to see, close down that chat window, we can see here it's getting that room section from here, the actual ID, and then checking on that room table for us. And it's doing the exact same thing down here for select as well. So at least we can see it is getting that information for us. And if we go back to our application, we can actually see it's already updated 2 users online. And if I refresh, you can see it starts as 1, and then it'll bump up to 2 as soon as it recognizes that I'm connected. So it does look like that is working like we expect it to. Now, the next thing we need to listen for is whenever our messages are actually saved inside of our database. So we can come in here with an on, and we want to do a broadcast here. You could do a Postgres change, but it's honestly not ideal for this type of situation. We're going to be doing a broadcast instead. And we want to get an event of insert. So we'll say insert just like this. Whenever there's an insert change inside of our database, we want to get whatever that payload is and do something with that. Let's make this a little bit wider so it's easier to see. Close that off. There we go. And this payload specifically is going to give us a record property. So we can say record, and that is going to be payload.record. There we go. And that record is what we actually want to use and pass along into this array. Now I'm going to be passing this message along at the end of the array. So we can come into here and I can just create a brand new object where the ID is my record ID, text is record text, created as, record created at. We want our author ID. And then we're going to get our author properties as well, which is just going to be record.author.name. And this is going to be an underscore here. And we're going to do the exact same thing for our image URL. There we go. So that's going to be all the information that we get back from this particular piece of state. Now, just setting this up alone is not going to be enough. You can see when I type a message and click send, it's still making me refresh the page before I see what this is. And that's because we're not actually setting up any broadcasting. Right now, we're not doing this broadcasting. We could manually do this broadcasting inside of our backend if we really wanted to. We can come in here and manually broadcast. But now what happens if a message is added from somewhere else? We will want to make that work. So instead, what we're going to do inside of Supabase is we can set up another trigger and another database function to be able to run anytime our messages table gets an insert. We want to run a function that's going to essentially broadcast this information out to our users. So I'm essentially going to prompt the MCP server to do that for us again. I gave it the create DB functions prompt, and I essentially just said create a database function that is triggered whenever a new row is added to the message table. This function should send a broadcast to, and I messaged the channel in the real-time channel with the following data. And I mentioned I want the ID, the text created at author ID, author name, and author image URL. And it should hopefully go through and do that. I'm going to say allow this to actually run the migration for that. And we should hopefully see it create this on our backend for us. We can go over to our backend and start working on that while it's finishing up over here. So we can go into our database. We can specifically look for the triggers section. And you can see here we have a message broadcast trigger after an insert. So that's what we want. And it should call a function right here. And this function does all the code for us. You can see it's getting a bunch of information. It's getting us the channel name that it's supposed to send to. And then it's going through and building out what that broadcast should look like. You can see this is a ton of code to write that's not really super fun to write. So it's nice that this MCP server can take care of all of that for us. So let's go ahead and actually see if this works like we expect it to. We'll just refresh our page to make sure we have everything up to date. We'll just send along a message called new, give it a quick second, and it still looks like it's not actually being passed along to this user right here. So after a bit of digging, I figured out what our problem was. I forgot to wrap our code in the Supabase real-time set auth. This essentially allows us to set whatever our user is so we know that we are authenticated as that user. This is a promise, so we need to make sure that we run all of our code for our channel directly inside of this section. Now we can come out of here, we can say let channel or new channel, which is a real-time channel. And then here I can set that new channel just like that. And then all the way up here, actually I should probably have another variable called cancel, which we're going to set to false. And here, if cancel, then I want to return. So I just don't want to run any of my code if I'm in the cancel state, because all the way down here, I'm going to say cancel is equal to true. and if I don't have a channel return. So essentially, if for some reason it restarts my use effect before it actually gets to the code inside of here, it'll just make sure it cancels out everything. So now if I do that, that at least means that I should be able to authenticate with this. So let's try to send a new message and click send. And it looks like we're still not getting that new message coming through. I think part of the reason for this may be that the data I'm getting is not what I expect. So let's just put a console log in here to get our payload and see what our payload looks like. So we'll just give that a quick refresh. We'll just send along a random message. And hopefully, if we inspect our page, bring this over, we'll try to send a new message along. It looks like even when we're sending messages, it's actually never getting the code inside of here. So this insert event is never running. My next guess is that there's something wrong in our broadcasting. So I want to go over to the permission for our function that we have that's sending out our broadcast. I just want to read through what this looks like. And if I'm going through this real quick, I see here that it's doing a PG notify. We want to do a realtime.send instead. We don't need this label here. We can just send along our information. And then inside this object, we don't need all these additional things. We can essentially just have this content right here, which is what we expect to have. There we go. Let's clean up the spacing on that. And then we need to pass along essentially a few other things. We have this tg_op variable we can use. Essentially, that's going to be like insert, update, delete, and so on. And we also need to specify what the room is. We have that as our channel name. So we can just say channel name just like that. And that should be everything we need to do to be able to get this working like we expect. Let's just give that a quick save, see if it works like we expect it to. And now we can come back over to our code and let's refresh our page and try sending a brand new message. We'll just send GGGGG. And it says failed to send message. So it's hitting this trigger right here, but there's something failing in it. There was two main problems. First was that I had this being cast to text, which obviously I don't need. And secondly, I need to pass along true, false, whether or not this is a private or a public channel. And we say that this is private, so we can just specify this as true. And once we have that all done, we can save that. And this should hopefully fix all those problems that we were having. Now, if I just come over here and I try to send a message, you can see that I'm getting a new type of error. It says cannot read property undefined of ID. So if we come over into this section and we look, it's because of our record related stuff. So if we actually inspect our page and we look at what our payload is, we can see our object here. Our object is payload and it just has the data directly on it. There's no payload or record or anything like that. You can just see it's just inside the payload. So we can get rid of this record completely just like that. And this should give us the information we need. So let's go ahead and test that. We can just test a message that says hi, and I send that message along. And it looks like I'm not seeing any content, but that's actually somewhat to be expected because we're not using these messages anywhere. If I scroll up to the top of our page, this is where we're getting our messages and we're not using them. So these are our real-time messages. There we go. And we essentially want to combine together this into our visible messages, which is just our all-time or our current messages. There we go. And we want to add on our real-time messages at the end. And this one I want to reverse because again, we had to reverse it down here. So let's change this to our visible messages and see if that fixes our problem. We'll give this a quick refresh. And now we'll change this to say bye and we'll send that along. And I don't actually see it. There we go. It just popped up. So now you can see it says bye. And if I send something else, you can see that shows up as well. And if I have my other chat window open and I type something in this chat window, it shows up in this chat window. If I tap something in here, you can see it shows up over here. So it is properly propagating them between both. There's one small problem though. As I type in some content and I click enter, there's a small delay before it shows up, which is really not ideal. I want that content to show up here immediately. Essentially, I want to have optimistic updates. So I essentially want to create a new piece of state up here. I want to create a piece of state that is my sent messages. And my sent messages are essentially going to be just like my normal message, but they're also going to have a status that is optional. And this status, actually, it won't even be optional. It'll be required. And this status is going to be here, pending or error or success. There we go. Make sure that those are combined together. Perfect. So now my sent messages can also be added onto my list of messages. So I have my messages, I'm adding on my real-time messages, and at the bottom, I want my sent messages to always be there. And I'm just going to filter out all the messages that are already propagated in my real-time messages. So essentially, I'm taking my old messages from the server, adding on all my real-time messages, and then saving all my optimistic messages. But anytime my optimistic message is successful, I remove it from this list because it's already in this list right here. So we have all of that done, which is great. And also I was going to demonstrate this section. So like as I type, you can see it automatically scrolls me to the bottom. That's because of this reversing stuff that I'm doing right here. If I essentially remove this line for the reversing, and now I scroll all the way to the bottom here and I type in a new message, that message doesn't show up until I manually scroll the page down. So that's the whole reason I have that reverse section there, because now when I type in, you can see it automatically scrolls me to that bottom. So now what I want to do inside my chat input is I want to have a bunch of different essentially hooks I can listen to. On send, for example, is going to pass me along the message that the user is trying to send, and then I can save that message inside of my code. So I can say set sent messages. I can take all my previous messages, and now I want to add on this new message. So I can get the ID from my message.id. I get my text from my message text. My created at, I don't have that yet because the message hasn't been created. This is just like when I send the message. So I'm just going to get a new date.toISO string. There we go. I also don't know the author ID. Well, actually, I do know the author ID. It is me. So I can just say user ID. And I get all my author information as well. The name is just my name, and my image is my image URL. And the status on this one is going to be pending. There we go. So that gives me all the information for on send. So let's go ahead and actually implement that. So here we're going to just, we'll say props on send. There we go. And let's make sure that we get room ID up here as well. And this on send is taking in a message. And this message has an ID, a text, just like that. I think those are the only things that we use over here. Yes, those are the only things that we use. Yep, but we are getting an error. It says void is not assignable to type promise. Oh, that's just because over here in my chat input, this should just return void. No return at all needed. There we go. So now we just need to call on send properly. So right before we send something, we want to call that on send property, passing along essentially an ID. So we can say crypto.randomUUID to get us a brand new ID. And then we can pass along our text. And here we also need to pass along our ID. So we can say ID, pass that along here, and then we pass along that ID up here. That way we can link these together. So now in send message, I can make this take in an ID as well. And when I pass along my data, I can make sure that I pass along my ID as part of that data. So now it's just automatically generating the ID on the client for us. So now if I go back to my chat input, I have my on send being sent. If I go back over into here, we are actually getting that inside of our messages. I just want to make sure when I display my message that I display that status as well. So inside of these messages, these are also going to take in a status that is optional. And this status is going to come from this message section here. So we can say message and a status, and that status is going to be optional. So now I can modify what it looks like based on the status. So all the way up here, let's just use that cn function to get all of our code how we want it to. There we go. I can change this around because essentially I'm going to say that if my status is equal to pending, well then I want my opacity to be 70%, let's say. And then I can come down here, and I don't need all these objects. There we go. If my status is error, then I want to use a background of destructive, 10% opacity, and my text will also be destructive. There we go. Give that a quick save. So now hopefully we should be able to see what these look like based on these different statuses. I can manually pass along a status for now. So for example, if I pass along pending, you can see they're all partially transparent. If I pass along error, you can see that they have the red text and the red background, but we want this to be passed along automatically for us. So when I type in something here and I click send, you can see it starts out transparent and then it fades into the full value, which is exactly what we want. Now to be able to make sure we handle our success and error states properly, we can come in here with an on success send. There we go. This on successful send is going to take in a message as well, but now we have a full message that we can use. So we could say sent messages, and we essentially just replace our message with the full message properties from our message. So we can say that we essentially want to take all of the new message properties and use those and then set the status to success, just like that. And we can do essentially the exact same thing on error. So we can say on error sending, and I just want to replace the status of this with error, and I don't want to overwrite the message because all I'm going to get passed into this when we have an error is the actual ID. There we go. So let's go ahead and implement these functions as well. So we can say on successful send, that takes in a full message object. There we go. And then we're going to have on error send, which takes in the ID, get those properties. On error, pass in the ID. On success, we take in the data that we get passed back for us. So it's result.message. There we go. That should hopefully hook both of those up. So now over here, you can see they're hooked up properly. So now if I send something along, once it's successful, it goes to that success state, just like I expect. And if we, for some reason, had an error, we can just emulate that real quick by going into this particular section and send message. And let's just throw an error randomly. So we'll just say, after this, throw a new error. There we go, whatever. Send something along. You can see it actually looks like it's not quite working expected because it's supposed to return error of true. There we go. Now we'll just send along a hard-coded message like that. And now if I send, you can see we get that error state showing up. So that is working like we expect it to, which is great. Now the next thing that I want to work on is going to be that invite modal. So we can come into our components. We can say invite user modal.tsx. I'm going to paste in the code for this, but I'm going to be going over exactly what it is line by line, so you don't have to worry about not understanding what the code does. So let's scroll all the way to the very top of this section. Let's make sure that we get our dialog component. So we can say that we want to add dialog just like that. And then we also need to create a new add user to room action. So inside of here, let's export an async function, add user to room. For now, we'll just return null from there. So at least we have that showing up. And it looks like we're currently importing that dialog component. So that should hopefully get rid of this error up here. But if we look at our code, you can see the only prop we're getting in is our room ID, just like that. We might as well just inline this. There we go. Make that a little bit easier. And then for this particular section, we are using a Zod form here. So we have a Zod form for our user ID, minimum value of 1 for our user ID. You can see here we're tracking the open state of our actual dialog. And down here, it's just boilerplate dialog. You can see it's a dialog trigger. We have a button that just says invite user. So if we refresh our page and make sure we import this component, so if I come over to where we have that invite user modal, let's get rid of this placeholder one that we had and import the new one. There we go, give that a quick save. You can see we have this little button over here that just says invite user, just like we expect it to. Now let's go back into our actual page for that. There we go. And actually, we might as well give it a little space. You can see it's very cramped up on the edge over there. So let's go into our actual client page here. And you can see that we have a padding of 4 on this particular element. I want to just change it so that my padding of 4 goes right here. There we go. So that just pushes that element in just like we want. Now let's go back over to our invite modal. You can see our dialog content. When I click on this, rather straightforward. We have a title, we have some text, and then we have our form input. And you can see we're just using our controllers and form groups. So if we look up here, we have our use form from React Hook form, and then we're just setting up our controller. This is identical to the last controller we created, and same exact thing here. We have our buttons that are exactly the same as our last form. This is essentially identical to our new room form. We just removed the checkbox and changed this to say user ID instead of name. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. The only difference is here we have this add user to room, which takes in a room ID and a user ID, and we might as well pass those in as an object, just like that. There we go. Now let's go ahead and actually write out what this function looks like. We already know that it has a room ID and a user ID, so we have all of that content already done. First thing that we want to do is we want to make sure we have a user. So we can just say current user is equal to get current user. And if the current user is null, we send down an error. Next, we can get our admin client, and we want to check to see, are they a member? So we're just essentially coming into here. We're accessing our chat room member, getting the member ID of our current user and the room to see if they currently exist. If there is an error or the membership doesn't exist, the current user is not a member of the room, so we're going to throw an error. Next, we want to come down here and we want to try to get the user profile. So we can say here, our data is our user profile, which is our Supabase. We want to get that from the user profile for the user ID. So we can say here, hey, if the user doesn't exist, the user is not found. And then finally, we want to check to see if they're an existing member. So we can say data, existing membership. We can check on that exact same table, the member ID and the room ID, and to make sure, hey, are they a member of this table already? If they are a member, then we want to just throw an error specifically for that. And then finally, we can actually go ahead and try to do this insertion. So we're just trying to insert this data into here, our chat room ID and our member ID. If we have an error, we say there's an error. Otherwise, we just return that there was no error at all. Let's come in here and put a message as well. And we'll just say user added to room successfully. There we go. So that's that entire function created for us. And let's see if this works. Let's say that we try to add a user that doesn't exist. We'll just use a bogus user ID. We'll click invite and we should hopefully get user not found, just like we expect. Obviously, for our particular use case, we actually want to invite a user. So let's go ahead and go to a room where the user does not exist. We'll go to this my first room. There's only one person in this room. So let's try to invite our other user. Now to do that, we can just go to our Supabase, click on this users tab right here. This is going to give us the UIDs for all of our users. We'll copy over that UID because that's what we're going to be inviting the user with. We'll go into that room, click invite user, and we'll paste in that ID. And we're going to click invite user. And hopefully that sent along the invite for that user. We didn't see anything show up, but if we go to that other user's page and we go ahead and we check at the rooms that they're a part of, you can see now they're a part of my first room as well as my final room. And if we enter into here, we should have permission to be able to send messages back and forth between these two users. Now, the next thing that I want to work on is going to be infinite scroll. So for example, if we're on this my final room here and we scroll up, we want to load more messages when we get to the top. Currently, all the messages are on the page, but if we only load a few messages, so for example, in our page, let's minimize this all down, source app, and we want to go into our rooms page. And let's say instead of rendering 100, we only render 10 messages. Now, if I scroll, you can see I get stopped at that 10th message. I want to automatically load more messages with an infinite scrolling style behavior. So we need to add yet another hook into our application to manage that for us. So inside this client section, I want to scroll all the way down and I want to create a brand new hook called use infinite scroll. And we'll call it use infinite scroll chat to make it a little bit more clear. This is going to take in all of our starting messages as well as our room ID. That way I know which messages I've started with and I know what room I'm currently on. Let me make sure I spell infinite correctly. There we go. And now inside here, I want to keep track of our messages. So we're going to say our messages is by default our starting messages. And we're also going to keep track of a status. So we'll say status and set status. And the status is going to be idle, loading, error, or a status of done if we've finished loading all the possible messages that we could possibly load. There we go. That's all of our different statuses done. Also, I want to just make it so that if our starting messages dot length is equal to 0, well, we're already done because there are no more messages. So let's just make sure we default that to 0 to done. There we go. Also up here, I want to create a limit. This is essentially how many items I get at a time. We'll say that we get 25 every single time. Now let's go ahead and get our types implemented. There we go. Our starting messages and our room. All of that is perfect. Next, I want to have essentially a function that is going to be for triggering our query, or actually not even for triggering, just for like loading more messages. So we'll call this load more messages. There we go. This is going to be an async function, and this is where all of our fancy code is going to go. So if our status is equal to done, well, then we don't want to trigger this again. So we'll just return right here. Then we'll say Supabase is equal to create client. There we go. And we're going to set our status to loading. Also up here, we should probably not do this if our status is loading as well. So we'll just skip it if we're done or if we're currently loading, only if we're idle or errored. Then what I want to do is I want to get our data and our error by selecting from the message table, our ID, text created at author ID, our user profile with the name and the image URL. We want to get it for the specific room ID, and we want to get it where our created at is less than our first messages created at, which is making perfect sense for us. And then finally, we want to order them on created at in the exact same false ascending order and limit on the amount that we get. So essentially, we're just saying whatever our oldest message is, make sure the next messages we get are older than that one. That's going to be how we do this. Now, if we have an error, we can set our status to error and return. Otherwise, we're going to set our messages for this. And specifically, I want to put my early messages here at the top, and I want to just set them in reverse order. The exact same reason we needed to do this when we first got our messages is the reason I'm doing this here. I'm just putting them at the start and reversing them in their order, just like why we got them from the server. We had to do the exact same thing. Now I'm going to simplify this code a little bit by just saying our set status here. If our data.length is less than limit, we set it to done. Otherwise, we set it to idle. Essentially, if we have less items than our current limit, that means we've gotten all the items we could possibly get. So this is how we load more messages. We can return this as a function, load more messages, and status. And this will work fine for manually triggering it, but in our case, we want to automatically trigger it as soon as we scroll to the top. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a function called trigger query ref. And this is going to be essentially a ref we pass to one of our components or our functions here, and it's going to be passed to this very first chat message. So that way, once this one shows up on our page, we know to render more stuff. So this node is going to be a div element or null. And if our node is null, we just return. Otherwise, we want to get an intersection observer. And if our entry is intersecting, that means we are on the current page. And our entry.target is equal to our node. There we go. Close all this off, just like that. Now what we're saying is, hey, is our element on the page? And is our element the current one that we care about? If that's the case, I want to load more messages, and I also want to stop observing it. So we're going to say observer.unobserved node. That way it doesn't continually trigger over and over again. It's just saying, hey, once I first scroll to this, try to load me some more messages. Then what I want to do is I want to pass along a root margin here. and we're going to say the root margin is 50 pixels. That just means that as soon as our element is 50 pixels away from being on our page, then we want to trigger this. That way we don't have to wait until we scroll all the way to the top. It'll trigger it a little bit before we get to the very top. Finally, after that, we want to observe this node, and when we disconnect, we just want to disconnect. So every time this reruns, we disconnect. So anytime our element changes, it's going to disconnect us from here. So now we have this trigger query ref that we can pass along, and this we can just put directly on whatever node we want to trigger this, and it's going to call load more messages as soon as we try to trigger it. So let's try to use this. We'll scroll all the way to the top of our code here, and we can say const whatever is equal to calling that function and passing along our room ID and our starting messages, which is just the reversed version of our messages. And this is going to give us a bunch of stuff. It's going to give us our messages here. We're going to call this our old messages. It's going to give us our status, and it's going to give us our trigger query ref. So now, instead of using our normal messages down here, we can just use the old messages, which will account for all of our starting messages, as well as anything we've infinitely scrolled onto. And then we can use this trigger query ref directly on our chat message here. So we can pass along this ref property, which is our trigger query ref. And we only want to do this if it's the very first element inside of our array. So we can say here, our index, if our index is equal to 0, then we want to pass along, otherwise we pass along null. And now all we need to do is make sure that in our chat message, we pass along a ref and handle that properly. So here we want to have a ref, and this just uses the ref type from React. And we know that this is an HTML div element. Close that off. And then what we can do all the way down where we have our div is just pass along the ref just like that. That should be everything that we need to have perfect here. I can make sure that this is an optional property because we don't always need to pass it along. And then if we go back into our client, that cleans up all those errors. Also, I want to make sure we don't do this if we're currently loading. So we can say, and the status is not equal to, or actually we should only do it when the status is equal to idle. There we go. So if we are currently idle and we are the first element, then I add that trigger query ref. So when I scroll up to that, it's going to call all of our code that's inside of here to load more messages. If we expand this over and we go over to our Supabase section, you'll notice we have absolutely no permissions for accessing our messages or our user profiles. We need to set those up. So I just sent along a quick little message here. You can see we have our role level security policies for our rows. And I just said add a policy to the message table that allows users to view all messages for rooms they are a member of. Also add a policy to the user profile table that allows any authenticated user to read any role in that table. And that just makes it so that we can actually get the name and the image URL for the users. So we can see here, if I just click allow, it should hopefully go through and run that for me and add that information. Looks like it just finished. And if I refresh, we should see these policies over here. So if I look at this message, you can see here, it's checking the chat room to make sure they have access to that and are a member. That's correct. And if we look over here, we can see that this says that users can create themselves, discard, and authenticated users. Yep, there we go. That's just set to true so they can view all the rows inside that table. That hopefully should fix the problem we were having. So now if I scroll up to the very top, let's make sure we just refresh this real quick. And I scroll to the top, you can now see I have that infinite scroll. It's letting me keep scrolling until I get to the very top where there's no more data. Now I want to implement essentially a loading state so that users know that something's happening, because when I refresh and I scroll to the top, it's kind of jittery. I'm not sure what's happening. So essentially right before my visible messages, I'm just going to come in here. If my status is set to loading, well, then I want to come in here and I just want to add text that says loading more messages. And if my status is error, I just have a text that says error, as well as a button that lets me retry by calling that load more messages function directly automatically. So now let's go ahead and test this to see if it works. First of all, I'm going to just slow down this artificially. So we can just say await new promise. And we'll just say that we want a 1 second slowdown. So now if I refresh and I scroll to the top, you can see loading more messages. And then after a second, it works fine. And there's no more messages to load. So nothing else loads on our page, which is exactly what we want. Now let's go ahead and test what happens in the case that we have an error. So I'm just going to come in here. I'm going to say or true. So if we have an error, it's just going to automatically set the status to error. So now let's refresh our page. We're going to scroll to the top and you can see error loading messages. I can click retry. It's going to try to load them again, error, retry, and so on. So at least we know that that is working as well. And that's all it takes to create this real-time chat application. And it's super easy to take this even further and turn it into like a full Discord clone, for example, if you want. And again, if you're interested in checking out Supabase, which makes this real-time stuff incredibly easy to work with, they're going to be linked down in the description below. I personally really like their MCP server because it makes working with some of the more complicated parts incredibly simple because the AI can just handle that for you. With all that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.